Chapter 778. With a light click, the valve at the top of the tunnel, which didn't look heavy but was definitely heavy, finally opened. Sulu didn't rush out like a rookie. Although there was only a thin line between him and the rookie, he had been through hundreds of battles on the battlefield. He hung in the air, patiently waiting for the lubricating liquid to gradually moisten the spring that hadn't been rubbed for many years. At the same time, he carefully removed the traces around him and carefully recombined the pipes. He took out wet ash from his bag and deliberately smeared it on randomly. After doing all this, he slowly drilled out with the tip of his elbow against the valve above his head. After crawling through the tunnel with a small angle of nearly 60 meters, he finally came to the ground. He pushed open the door of the electrician's room inside the building with the dense green plants. Under the cover of the night, he quietly walked into the hall and used the fastest speed to look at the internal structure of the military court. He asked the old guy to temporarily replace the surveillance camera inside the court. He walked from the direction of the courtroom to the door. His footsteps were light and heavy, and he quickly determined his hiding position. The feeling of the soles of his boots was very clear. The tunnel was covered with strips of red carpet, and below it was a solid wood floor. The space below should be enough. The information given by Macho Back Mountain was detailed and accurate. Sulu lifted the carpet from the bottom of the courtroom, revealing the rough wooden floor underneath. He then took out a thin alloy wire from his backpack, threaded it into the other part of the carpet, and stepped on the bottom of his boots through the small groove at the front of the wooden floor. He lifted the wooden floor and lay down. He very methodically arranged the modified H-14 sniper rifle, the high firepower Langer pistol, and the military knife he made himself beside him. The cubicle under the floor looked like a coffin under the dim light. These cold-killing weapons seemed to be buried with the coffin. Sulu lay down calmly, took out 3 high-energy nutrition bars for students from his backpack, and ate them. He then pulled the thin alloy wire in his hand. With a soft hiss, the hard thin alloy wire rubbed against the groove at the end of the floor and turned the wooden floor over. At the same time, it quickly pulled the rolled-up red carpet towards the courtroom. The moment before darkness arrived, Sulu looked at the landscape lights on Robbie Avenue through the wide floor-to-ceiling window in the court. He looked at the balanced statue that represented the justice and fairness of the Federation's law and the heavy stone charter ceremony in the forest. He slowly narrowed his eyes. The red carpet rolled up smoothly and quickly covered the wooden floor. It returned to its original appearance, and no one could see any difference. For days later, this red carpet would be the road to freedom for Colonel Lake, who would be court-martialed. He would never have thought that there was someone waiting for him on this red carpet. The autumn wind was bleak, and the cold current from the direction of Lynn High made the temperature of the capital city drop abruptly. Under the strong pressure of the public, Parliament Hill was forced to give in to the government, and several very important bills of President Pobre's policy were passed. Not knowing whether it was because of this or because of the sudden cold weather, the strikes in the various regions of the Federation gradually came to an end. There were fewer angry protesters on the streets of the capital city, and the people who had returned to their normal lives and work began to care about tonight's dinner and whether they should add a few extra layers of thermal underwear. The military airport in the suburbs of the capital city was also ravaged by the cold wind. The soldiers of the Westwood Special Forces on the tarmac stared at the outline of the spaceship that was gradually becoming clearer in the sky. They were nervous and heavy, and did not care about the thin military uniform they were wearing at all. The Federation forces on the front line of the Empire had suffered several heavy blows in succession, and the Westwood's troops under the 4th Military Region had suffered the greatest losses. The morale and mentality of the troops on the front line had some very dangerous changes. The troops, who were specially approved by the Federation Parliament to be stationed in the capital city many years ago, were naturally angry. Big Stick Tian, who did not have any military position but had a very high prestige in the West Woods troops, had taken a warship to the front line of the Empire to deal with the problems of the frontline troops. He represented the West Woods to compete with the government for the right to speak. Other than him, there was no other suitable candidate. However, with the current complicated situation in the West Woods, once he left the old house in the Sunset State, who would be responsible for the safety of the little princess of the Zhong family? Especially since her legal guardian was now wanted by the Federation government. The spaceship of the Gu Bell Company slowly landed on the tarmac, and the roaring engine gradually calmed down. The escort warship at the junction of the atmosphere sent a signal to the airport hall, and the people on the tarmac swarmed over. A convoy of more than a dozen dark blue luxury cars passed by the Westwood Special Forces and slowly drove to the bottom of the spaceship. The cabin door of the Gu Bell Company spaceship opened, and Zhong Huiyan narrowed her eyes at the familiar yet strange S1 land. She walked down the escalator, carrying a small backpack on her back and still holding the old doll in her arms. The door of the dark blue luxury car opened, and Nan Xiangmei looked at the slowly approaching Zhong Huiyan with a sincere smile on her beautiful face. She said in a gentle voice, "Welcome." There was no real friendship between the families, especially between the other families of the 7 major families and the Zhong family of the West Woods. The Zhong family had always been an unusual existence among the 7 major families. When the Federation government tried to weaken or even eliminate the Zhong family, the other major families remained silent, and even joined in the feast of sharing the food with each other. The Nan family had never shown any special protection for the West Woods. But there was real friendship between the people in the family. When Su Le disappeared into the vast night, Mr. Tian was about to leave the West Woods. He could only rest assured that Zhong Huiyan would be handed over to a friend he truly trusted, and he had to ensure that this friend had enough strength to protect Zhong Huiyan. Although Mr. Tian rarely saw this friend after he dropped out of the first military academy, and although this friend was a woman, and she was already someone else's wife and mother, he still absolutely trusted her. It was always easier for men to trust their first love, and the rougher the man, the more so. Therefore, he solemnly handed Zhong Huiyan over to the current Mrs. Nan, Chao Jian of the past. Facts proved that Mrs. Nan was very worthy of Mr. Tian's trust. From the interstellar voyage from the West Woods to the capital ring, and then to the subsequent security work, the Nan family, who had always been low-key, did not hesitate to show their strength. Before the other forces could react, they safely brought Zhong Huiyan to the Nan family's exclusive manor. After Mrs. Nan arranged the life and studies of the little princess of the Zhong family, she handed the responsibility of taking care of the little girl to her daughter. She believed that her excellent and kind daughter would definitely take good care of the poor and lonely little princess who had lost her parents and guardian. From the details of life in the manor, Nan Xiangmei and Zhong Huiyan did get along very well. In the middle of the night, the 2 girls, who were very different in age, were still holding a pillow and chatting with relish. "I like your character. You're very gentle, and you're very delicate. You don't have the lethality that makes people hate you." Zhong Huiyan stared at Nan Xiangmei with her bright, gem-like eyes. She brushed her hair aside and stared at Nan Xiangmei beside her, saying, "Jian Shui, and Zhu, you look too lethal, so I don't like them." Nan Xiangmei frowned and looked at the little girl beside her with mixed feelings. In the face of such a mature conversation, she did not know how to answer and even felt inexplicably shy. "But so far, I still like Shang Qiu more." Zhong Huiyan retracted her bare legs under the brand new nightgown and said seriously, "So, you have to please me more." Nan Xiangmei finally couldn't help but laugh. She covered her mouth and whispered, "Why should I please you? He's my guardian. If he wants to get together with his wife, he has to ask for my opinion." Zhong Huiyan cutely wrinkled her nose and sighed with an adult tone, "Of course, if I were a few years older, I would definitely not agree with any of them." Nan Xiangmei held the pillow and tried hard to hold back her laughter. Her shoulders kept twitching. After a long while, she calmed down and said, "He's now a fugitive. I don't know where he is. I don't know how he eats, if he sleeps well, if he's safe. By the way, do you care that Su Lu is a fugitive?" Zhong Huiyan asked curiously. "Shouldn't you call him brother?" Nan Xiangmei was paying attention to another question. "I call him that in front of him, but I like to call him by his name behind his back." Zhong Huiyan smiled sweetly and said, "Don't tell him in the future. By the way, answer my question just now." Nan Xiangmei quietly leaned against the soft pillow. Her black hair flowed down like a quiet river. She said in a trance, "Of course not. What about you?" "Me?" Zhong Huiyan seemed to have heard the funniest question. Her eyes curved into two lovely crescent moons as she pointed to her nose and said, "When I met him, he was already a fugitive." "How old were you at that time?" Nan Xiangmei asked curiously. 5 years old. Zhong Huiyan explained seriously, "But I haven't forgotten anything." In the quiet manner, on the soft bed, in the peaceful night, the big girl and the little girl were talking in the middle of the night. In the corner of the room, the old doll was looking at the starry sky. In a very ordinary apartment in the capital special district, there was a room that was lit until late at night. It seemed to be brighter than the stars in the night sky. Bai Yulan sat by the window and squinted at the stars in the night sky. The window was half open, and the smoke of the 37 brand cigarette between his fingers came out through the gap. The bedroom door was pushed open. His wife woke up from her sleep and rubbed her eyes. She looked at him by the window and asked, "Why aren't you sleeping?" "I have an early shift tomorrow." The Army General Hospital was very strict with attendance management. She didn't want to be criticized by those supervisors, so she was in a bad mood. After seeing the cigarette between Bai Yulan's fingers, her mood was even worse. Bai Yulan was awakened and subconsciously threw the cigarette out of the window. She looked at her slightly bulging belly and apologized, "I'm sorry, I was thinking about something." So, pregnant women generally had a bad temper, not to mention the female nurse who dared to scold Su Lu directly. But she felt that Bai Yulan's mood was indeed a little strange tonight. She walked to the window and asked, "What happened?" Bai Yulan quickly closed the window to block the cold wind. She stepped forward and gently hugged her waist that had become a little thicker. After a moment of silence, she explained, "There is a very stupid guy who may need my help." Chapter 779. The body of the woman in his arms was still soft at first, but it gradually stiffened. She thought of the words he said in the hospital room, the details after marriage, the strange soldiers that appeared in the Army General Hospital, and the thick bag of money that was still in the drawer. She pushed Bai Yulan away and said in a panic, You are really from Group 7, then, the stupid guy you were talking about, is he Su Lu?" Bai Yulan looked at his wife calmly and said gently, "I thought you already knew. Although I have retired from the army, that guy is still my comrade, and at the same time, he is also my boss." After returning from the front lines, he was like an ordinary man without any sharp past, doing the work of a stay-at-home husband. However, after that incident, whether it was going to the black market to buy chicken or cutting broccoli in the kitchen, he was always waiting for a call from someone, an order. However, even when the broccoli was softened by the boiling water, the phone still did not ring, and there was no order. He did not even know where that guy was hiding and what he was preparing to do. From what he knew, that guy was definitely preparing to do something very big, but he could not find the opportunity to participate. Bai Yulan looked at his wife's worried and panicked expression calmly, and his eyes lowered slightly, landing on her slightly bulging stomach. He gently stroked it with his right hand and said in a low voice, "I promise you, as long as the boss does not look for me, I will not leave you." 7 giant Federation battleships left the Huang-E galaxy and headed for planet Mo-Hua. The Federal forces suffered an unprecedented heavy blow on that planet, and these giant battleships carried the hope of a counterattack and the confidence of victory, especially the main battleship. The 17th Armored Division of the 1st Military Region was on that main battleship because of its valiance and cunning to continue its undefeated glory. Because of the order from the highest level of the Federation government and the military, the 17th Division ended its rest in the capital ring early and returned to the front lines filled with blood and death. For this transfer order, the outside world usually thought that it was because the front lines urgently needed troops for victory, but for Commander Qinghai and all the officers of the 17th Division, there was a hidden reason behind it that made them unhappy. However, compared to enduring the pressure of political intrigue in the capital ring, the troops were probably more willing to go to the front lines and fight the Empire with real swords and spears. Furthermore, before the troops left, the 17th Division had forcibly taken back the dozen or so Team 7 members they had captured. The blue background of the universe appeared on the large porthole. The body of the spaceship that had just finished traveling through the warp hole was still warm. Xiong Linquan leaned against the slightly hot metal wall, frowned with a cigarette in his mouth, and looked at the scenery outside. But in his mind, he was thinking about the moon in the capital special district. Times are pressing, and can force a man to become a cripple, and can also force a rough man to become a sentimental poet. Especially when they find that they are powerless against many things, even anger. It is difficult for them to develop any other emotion except for lament and melancholy. Many soldiers of the 17th Division were squatting or standing in the corners of the battleship. Some of them were members of the 17th Division, while others were officers from the training base. Commander Heelay snatched the cigarette from De Xiong's mouth, lit up his own coarse tobacco, and said in a somewhat muffled voice, "I wonder how the instructor is right now." Xiong Linquan spat fiercely, took the cigarette, and said, "I've never seen a guy as fierce as the boss. Even if he has to fight against the entire Federation, nothing will happen to him. Nothing will happen to him." In fact, what these men who were rushing to the battlefield wanted to say was, "Nothing can happen to him. He hasn't contacted me, but I can imagine his situation. But I think he should have contacted you. Although I am not happy about this, I still beg you to tell me where he is right now." A special guest had come to the independent villa in the West Mountain compound today. Ever since Zhou Yingxing had been temporarily suspended from his position as Minister of Defense, this villa had become abnormally quiet, so not many people screamed and lost their composure because of this special guest. As for Zhou Yu, she would never lose her composure because of another woman. Zhou Yu gently adjusted the red flower arrangement on the table, her expression calm. She didn't even look at the person opposite her, as if she didn't recognize that the person sitting in front of her was the national idol who was popular throughout the entire universe. "I can't understand your unhappiness, and I don't understand what position you are in to ask me about his whereabouts." She lowered her head and seriously cut the flower, saying softly, "If I'm not mistaken, you are from the Lees of Philadelphia, and the person who wants to kill him right now is General Li Jiedu. I am from the Li family, and Li Jiedu is my cousin." Jian Shui took off the hood of her windbreaker. Her black ponytail bounced out and swayed. Her beautiful face revealed an inexplicable sense of pride. "But I'm more than that. I'm his fiancée." Zhou Yu's hand that was holding the special flower scissors froze slightly, and then she smiled and replied, "So you are questioning me with this identity, but I don't think you can really get married." She raised her head and looked at Jian Shui's impeccable face, exclaiming in her heart. She calmly said, "You two are too dazzling. If you two really get together, the eyes of the Creator will go blind from jealousy." Jian Shui's gaze moved from the red flower arrangement on the table to the big red flower in Zhou Yu's hair. After a moment of silence, she said, "You are very beautiful and dazzling." "Thank you for the compliment," Zhou Yu calmly replied. Regarding Su Li's life, you have participated enough. Jian Shui suddenly smiled charmingly, and her eyes twinkled. She didn't look like a star, but just a sly actress. If you continue to participate, I don't know if the creator will be jealous, but I will be. Zhou Yu slowly put down the flower scissors, raised her head and looked at the other quietly, not saying a word. One was a former national idol, a male creature that had once charmed the entire universe. The other was a lady in red, a powerful male creature that had once charmed Li Feng and Li Xiaotong. At this moment, sitting calmly opposite each other, the bright red flower between them suddenly lost its color. I don't know where he is now, but as I said just now, since the creator chose to make him dazzling, then he won't die so easily. Zhou Yu smiled and said, although he still has a lot of secrets that I believe you and I don't know, I believe that with those secrets, no one in the capital special district can easily kill him. Jian Shui was silent for a long time, then looked at her calmly and said, I'm here today because of one thing. If you can see him, please tell him. Li Feng is back. The military spaceport in the suburbs of the capital was responsible for accepting extremely secret missions for 2 consecutive days. After the landing of the spaceship from the West Woods the day before, another light warship broke through the autumn clouds and landed at a high speed in an almost domineering manner. The wind swept through the tarmac at high speed, rolling up countless green and yellow leaves and hitting the ground crew soldiers with a crackling sound. The surface of this light warship was extremely dirty. The surface of the warship that was basically used for vacuum missions was actually covered with greasy dust. It could be imagined that before this warship received the order to return, it must have been carrying out a military mission on a planet on the front line. The edge of the engine cluster armor at the back of the warship's abdomen was even scorched by the Empire's standard missiles. Seeing this detail, the soldiers at the spaceport were extremely shocked. What kind of urgent mission did this warship bring back? They didn't even have time to repair such heavy damage and actually took such a huge risk to cross countless light years to return at high speed. The somewhat deformed cabin door was forcibly pushed open by hydraulic machinery, and a burly Federation colonel walked out. His footsteps were unusually steady, and there was no expression on his young and handsome face. However, anyone who saw him seemed to be able to feel a terrifying violent aura, as if this person wanted to, he could tear down the cabin wall of the warship at any time and use it as a knife to chop off countless people's heads. The officers from the Ministry of National Defense who came to receive them came forward. They could clearly feel that this colonel, who was known to be invincible in the military, was in a very bad mood, so no one dared to say anything unnecessary. They directly took out the electronic document signed by Mr. President and General Li Jiedu and handed it over to him, asking him to sign it. Li Feng stared at his father's signature on the electronic document, which was as disciplined and strict as ever. Suddenly, he frowned, and an extremely cold light burst out from his slightly sunken eye sockets due to the long journey. After signing his name on the electronic document, he fiercely stabbed the electronic pen into the screen. The screen shattered into pieces, and the pen tip, which was not sharp at all, stabbed deeply into General Li Jiedu's signature. The autumn wind blew, and Li Feng strode to the dark green military vehicle. With a gloomy face, he pulled the driver out of the vehicle and threw him more than 10 meters away. Then, he stepped on the gas pedal and rushed out of the spaceport. 5 minutes later, the dark green military vehicle roared and arrived at a military building 40 kilometers away. The military vehicle did not slow down. Under the dumbfounded gazes of the military police, it directly broke the alloy pole at the gate. Then, accompanied by the ear-splitting screech of the brakes and the smell of burnt tires, the vehicle stopped in front of the stone steps. The officers of the Special Guard Regiment of the 1st Military Region tried to stop him from breaking into the general's office. Li Feng's face turned livid, and he directly kicked them. The terrifying iron leg was like a missile, and no one dared to stop it. the officers all tried to avoid it. So, the hard soles of the boots directly kicked on the hard door, and the door was shattered into pieces. The force splashed in all directions, and the officers all had a few more wounds on their bodies. Lee Jae-do, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation, took off his glasses in confusion. Looking at the violent scene in front of the door and then at his son, he frowned and said unhappily, "I'm very happy that you can come back so soon. But as a soldier, when will you change your violent temperament? If your grandfather was still alive, he would be very disappointed to see you like this." Li Feng looked at his father, who was still as handsome as before, and his heart, which had been violent since he was 12 years old, suddenly felt very sad. He roared with a hoarse voice, "If my grandfather was still alive, he would definitely kill you with his own hands." Chapter 780. The two sentences were exchanged in an instant. The father and son understood a lot of things at the same time. Li Feng finally understood why the man called Silan Tiger would insist on keeping a distance from the outside world, especially in front of Fei Qing. Li Zidao, on the other hand, quickly grasped the source of Li Feng's anger. He was shocked to find out that Li Feng had such a deep relationship with the man who died on the ancient bell. Li Feng didn't ask his father what the big explosion of the ancient bell had to do with him because he knew it was useless. He just looked at him with extremely complicated emotions. Li Jae-do didn't explain anything and just looked at Li Feng calmly. His thin and strong fingers subconsciously knocked on the smooth surface of the desk. Li Feng took a deep breath. His burly body was full of masculinity. He frowned and stared, and said in a voice like steel grinding, "I left Philadelphia for the West Woods when I was 12 years old. When I was growing up, there was a strong man in front of me. I learned from him and tried to catch up and even surpass him. I never thought that such a strong man would die because of such a disgusting conspiracy, so I was very angry." Li Jae-do looked at his son silently and slightly raised his eyebrows to catch his real emotions. He said leisurely, "I'm your father. Now I want him to be my father." Li Feng's eyes seemed to be burning. He stared at his father behind the desk with extremely complicated feelings. Li Jae-do slowly closed his hands and looked at the wrinkles between his fingers with his head slightly tilted. He seemed to be digesting the heavy psychological blow given to him by his most proud son. After a while, he looked up and stopped the argument about the ancient bell and the tiger with great wisdom and decisiveness. He said indifferently without any expression on his face, "You should have seen the order signed by Mr. President and me. Then get ready to fight." "Fight?" Li Feng's voice became sharp, and the violent masculinity unique to young men suddenly turned into deep mockery and sorrow. He looked at his father behind the table and said with a hoarse voice, "For the sake of forcing the warship to land on Umo Hua planet, many of the reinforcements on the ground died. In the end, I received the order to turn back immediately. I should be on that planet right now, fighting to the death with that empire's princess, but you want me to return to this disgusting land to fight Sulu? This is not my battlefield, and this is not my battle." Li Feng slowly put on his military cap, and he prepared to leave this room that made it difficult for him to breathe. "I'm not asking you as a father." General Li Jae-do looked at his son's silhouette expressionlessly. His voice was emotionless. "I am ordering you as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Federation and as the commander of the 1st Military Region." He stood up from behind the table, his entire person calm and sharp like an icicle that had been dormant for many years. "Colonel Li Feng, remember your identity. You are a soldier." Li Feng's tall and sturdy body suddenly tensed up. His youthful face, which was full of violent emotions, suddenly twitched. At this moment, he mobilized the terrifying power in his body to control his emotions. However, a moment later, the corners of his mouth curled up slightly and he began to laugh in a somewhat neurotic manner. He turned around to look at his father, and with an innocent and strange smile, he said, "I agree." Looking at the broken office door, staring at the ground after Li Feng left, Li Jiedu's expression was calm, and he did not let his subordinates see any problems. However, in his heart, he was already extremely vigilant, and there was even a faint sense of regret. He was vigilant that the West Woods tiger had such a great influence on Li Feng outside of Philadelphia's notice. Although the tiger was dead, this influence had continued to this day, so he had to admit that he might have made a very unforgivable mistake by transferring his son back from the front line to deal with Su Lu. In addition to these emotions, Li Jiedu's heart also had a very faint sense of sadness. The so-called middle age was the beginning of old age. Li Feng's words about his father had successfully stabbed him after all. But it didn't matter. After he picked up the phone and ordered the reduction of Colonel Li Feng's command authority, he thought silently, it really didn't matter. One day, you will know that I am right. Everyone will have to admit that they are right, and that day will come soon. The building complex on the west side of Robbie Avenue was heavily guarded. Today, there were no big shots coming to visit, and there were no important cases to be heard. The agents with serious expressions walking through the Stone Charter ceremony and the Statue of the Balance were carrying out a routine security check, but today's check was particularly strict. Then, a group of field troops in armored military vehicles came to the judge's court for the second round of security check. These elite soldiers under the Iron 7th Division expressionlessly asked the agents of the Federation Investigation Bureau, who had just finished their work, to leave the relevant area. As for the bailiffs who were originally in charge of the security work, they had long disappeared. The Iron 7th Division sent a reinforced company. More than 100 elite soldiers were divided into 3 groups. They carefully and fastidiously checked the security facilities everywhere, including the underground passage under the court. The soldiers checked the dark and wet walls of the passage almost centimeter by centimeter, especially the valves that led to the ground. When they confirmed that there were no traces of intrusion, they put up a seal made of polymer material and responsibly signed their names. More than a dozen soldiers in the courtroom were carefully probing every corner with a battlefield life detection device. The red-carpeted passage had been probed countless times during the inspection process. As for the possible hiding places, they had even used engineering nails to create a strong physical blockade. Around the courtyard outside the building, the reinforced soldiers of the Iron 7 Division had set up 4 barricades that extended for nearly 300 meters. Between the lush trees further away, the infrared sensors had also started working. When a leaf was blown off by the autumn wind, there would be a beeping sound to eliminate the abnormality. At this point, the military court had been completely inspected. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division had confirmed that the inside was clean. If someone tried to break in from the outside on the day of the trial, they would have to face the most efficient firepower barricade of the federal forces. The tall floor-to-ceiling windows welcomed the light of the clear autumn day. The mottled light scattered on the red carpet, making the passage from the courtroom to the door look like an abstract painting full of strange lines and blocks of color. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division who were on high alert both inside and outside the building naturally did not know that under the passage that had just been scanned countless times, there was a person whose breathing had become extremely slow. His skin temperature had even dropped by a lot, making him look like a strange stone. And no matter how great a war was, it was impossible to determine victory or defeat through a single battle. It was always pacing back and forth between attack and retreat, not to mention the war between the Federation government and the 7 great families that had been going on for tens of thousands of years, and perhaps would go on forever. The great strike that had shaken countless galaxies had ended. The anger of hundreds of millions of people forced the Parliament Hill, which was secretly controlled by the 7 great families, to concede to the President and the government and pass several very important bills. However, the Federation government and the President himself knew very well that the 7 great families with astonishing hidden influence would absolutely not be willing to accept defeat. They had already mentally and materially prepared for the other side's crazy counterattack. However, to the Federation government's surprise, after the Great Strike, the 7 great families maintained a strange silence. The Zhong family of the West Woods that had fallen into discord was temporarily out of the picture. In the past few days, other than the Nanxiang family announcing that they had taken over the protection of the Zhong family's little princess, nothing else important had happened. This silence was very strange and very dangerous. The 7 great families seemed to be waiting for something to happen, waiting for some kind of opportunity to strike and kill. The government easily linked the silence of the 7 great families to the disappearance of Su Lu. An uneasy sense of urgency reverberated through various agencies and departments. The Federation Bureau of Investigation, the Bureau of Proclamation, and the related strategic research laboratories all began to operate at high speed. They had to calculate what the 7 great families were waiting for, or to put it more directly, where was Colonel Su Li's target? Early in the morning, there was a drizzle of autumn rain, making the entire capital city cold and wet. Then there was a sudden gust of wind, blowing the light yellow leaves into the puddles on the streets, struggling to stay afloat. President Pobre stood on the balcony of his official residence with a deep frown. Cui Zedong stood on the balcony of the Bureau of Proclamation with a numb expression. Li Jiedu stood on the balcony with a calm expression. Like the elders of the 7 great families hiding behind the wind and rain, they looked at the autumn wind and rain in silence. On the lakeside balcony at the back of Macho Mountain, Lady Tai, wearing a light velvet windbreaker, silently looked at the dense rain circles on the lake and said softly, "Call our old friends again. It should be more peaceful these days. That young man clearly doesn't want us to be too deeply involved." Shenli stood behind Lady Tai and said with a frown, "According to your suggestion, Mr. Zion is already sick. But the information provided by the Foundation includes 15 valid targets, including the President's official residence. I can't judge which one Colonel Su Lu will choose." "No need to guess," Lady Tai said, "this is his battle, not ours." The big shots stood on the balcony and looked at the autumn wind and rain, but they didn't know where the violent wind and rain would fall in the next moment. The number 2 figure of Green Dragon Mountain, Jin Chaode, was going to visit the Special Capital District tomorrow. At such a sensitive time, this most important leader of the anti-government army after the leader of Nanshui still received a warm welcome from the Federation government. The planned welcome ceremony was extremely grand. The Federation's Vice President Byron had died under the gun of Shi Qinghai. According to the principle of political equality, the one who was supposed to greet Mr. Jin Chaode at the spaceport should have been Vice President Zion of the Federation Parliament. However, Vice President Zion proposed to the official residence that he couldn't attend because of his poor health. Half an hour later, Vice President Zion suddenly said that he would attend the welcome ceremony at the spaceport. After receiving this somewhat strange news, President Pobre left the balcony with a calm expression. General Li Jiedu stood on the balcony and took a phone call with a smile. In the building painted with the small eye pattern, there was an excited shout. "Target confirmed, Su Lu will appear at the spaceport." Chapter 781. Only by understanding the enemy could one defeat the enemy. The Small Eyes unit gathered the best talents from various agencies of the Federation. They also had authority that normal departments could not imagine. The members even knew from the beginning that Su Lu had a strange connection with the Federal Central Computer. As for Su Li's information and files from childhood, they had already studied them thoroughly. The more he researched, the more he realized that Su Lu, who looked very ordinary in appearance and temperament, had a shocking past and terrifying strength. With the continuous setbacks of the pursuit, Small Eyes troops were beginning to be filled with a negative atmosphere of disappointment. They were becoming less and less confident in capturing or killing Su Lu, and they were not even sure what the other's next target would be. Knowing which direction the wind was blowing had always been the most difficult thing to do. Fortunately, at this time, the seemingly insignificant arrangement of deputy speaker Xi, and ignited the rapidly active cells in their brain. This politician, who was strongly supported by Mao Zedong, revealed some very useful information in this detail. If Su Lu, who was hiding in the dark, wanted to make a big move, he would definitely cooperate with the big families that were trying to fight against the government. The analysts in the Small Eyes unit firmly believed this, because in their opinion, no matter how strong an individual was, it was impossible to be stupid enough to fight against the entire machine of the Federation alone, let alone someone like Colonel Su Lu, who had a rational engineer's mind. And according to their analysis, the most important reason for Su Li's anger was betrayal, and the committee member Jean Chowda, who was going to visit the capital special district, was the person behind the Green Dragon Mountain Central Committee's decision to betray Shi Qinghai. An insignificant change in detail and the support of the personality analysis, they came to the most firm conclusion. Su Li's target was the second person of Green Dragon Mountain at the spaceport in 2 days. 2 days later, the spaceship from S2 slowly landed at the spaceport of the capital. The spaceship that was cleaned on the old moon base sparkled under the autumn sun, and it contrasted with the flashing welcoming words on the giant holographic screen in front of the spaceport. Jean Chowda looked through the porthole at the grand welcoming crowd on the tarmac, as well as the Federation government officials at the front of the crowd, and frowned imperceptibly. Such a small action seemed to cause some discomfort between his eyebrows. He roughly dipped his finger into the cup, dipped it in the scalding tea, and smeared it on his eyebrows. His eyebrows that were stained with tea glittered, just like his hair that was combed until it was shiny. No one could tell that this big shot in the anti-government army who was nearly 70 years old was wearing an expensive wig. It was said that the capital city had not been very peaceful recently, but the old man was not worried. The Federation government had to be responsible for his safety. As for the rumored bait, he laughed mockingly. He and Chao Chudao had been fighting for decades, and in the end, he had lived longer and won in the end. Now that the detestable intelligence chief was dead, who could beat him? A female staff member walked over, bent down and reported to him the following arrangements, as well as the relevant etiquette requirements after leaving the spaceport. This female staff member of Green Dragon Mountain was the closest subordinate of Jean Chowda. She was in her early 30s, and her face was beautiful. It was the most seductive period of her life. When she bent down, her collar extended outwards, naturally revealing her soft white skin, which was very charming. Jean Chowda smiled as he looked at the spring scenery under her collar. He did not hide the pleasure and greed in his eyes. Probably because she felt his gaze, this female staff member subconsciously reached out her hand to cover her chest. Then she realized something, looked at him nervously, and moved her hand away in panic. "Don't be afraid of anything." Jean Chowda laughed like an ordinary old man, and then his expression suddenly became serious. He said, "Only those who are not loyal to the organization and do not obey the orders of the superiors are the targets of our struggle." Although this female staff member had been serving Mr. Jean for 3 years, every time she saw this leader who was famous for his cruel internal cleansing in Green Dragon Mountain, she still could not get rid of her nervousness and fear. She especially did not know if her subconscious action of covering her chest would make Mr. Jean severely criticize her for having too much rotten consciousness. Sometimes, it is better for a woman to be a little shy. Committee member Jean laughed as he stood up and walked toward the hatch of the spaceship. Perhaps it was because this was how he felt earlier, or perhaps it was because there was a grand welcome ceremony waiting for her on the tarmac, but the female staff member didn't feel any anger at all. The closer he got to the cabin door, the calmer Jean Chowda's expression was, and the more determined his eyes were, the more he looked like a revolutionary leader that people were used to seeing. As the person in charge of the strict education in Green Dragon Mountain in the 54th year of the constitutional calendar, Mr. Jean Chowda had always been known for his decisiveness, and this temperament directly contributed to his trip to the capital. In his opinion, with the outbreak of war with the Empire and the gradual implementation of the Great Reconciliation Agreement, the anti-government forces in Green Dragon Mountain were gradually being marginalized in the social system of the Federation. To be more precise, Green Dragon Mountain no longer had any future, so he had to seize the time to choose a new ship before this big ship sank. He was already 72 years old, but he did not want to die. He still wanted to continue to have power. He liked the feeling of controlling the life and death of others. But just like Schiller's masterpiece said, when two sides were at war, the officials could surrender, but the emperor could not. The leader of Nanshui would never surrender to the government of the Federation, so he had no choice but to surrender. No, Mr. Jean Chowda solemnly looked at the slowly opening cabin door and listened to the faint sound of military music. He firmly thought in his heart, this is not surrender, but cooperation. Why should you be the emperor? The old man thought of his partner of many years, the leader of Nanshui, and indignantly thought. However, the shadow of fear had long occupied the depths of his heart. In the past few decades in Green Dragon Mountain, the name of Nanshui was like an omnipresent shadow that shrouded everyone. The cabin door slowly opened, and the refreshing and unfamiliar wind of the capital city blew into his face. Mr. Jean Chowdick put on a somewhat forced smile and walked down. At this moment, he suddenly realized that only by leaving Green Dragon Mountain and coming to this area where Nanshui could not influence, could he truly feel the happiness of not being afraid. The red carpet stretched to the end of the hall. Mr. Jean Chowda and the vice-chairman of Zion warmly shook hands, then hugged each other, and then exchanged small gifts. There were also cute children who sent fresh flowers to each other. According to the ancient tradition, the image of white doves flying in the air was played on a huge hologram. The military band began to play the traditional country music of Mr. Jean Chowda's hometown, S3 Gunjo. The jubilant welcome ceremony seemed to be going on very normally. Ordinary people and officials could not feel the strange and tense atmosphere around the airport at all. Only the parties who were possible targets, and the combat forces responsible for setting up the ambush circle, could really smell the dry and tense wind and hear the sound of the string getting tighter and tighter in the autumn wind. Mr. Jean Chowda entered the bulletproof car. There were still no gunshots, no explosions, and no accidents. From time to time, the snipers who occupied the high positions reported the situation in the command system. The two words, safe and clean, were constantly exchanged. The emergency door of the airport's barbed wire fence had already been opened. A team of silent federal forces was guarding the outside. As long as there was an accident, they could rush in with the cooperation of countless snipers in the shortest time possible, find the target, and kill him. This newly formed action force under the command of Small I was obviously different from ordinary special forces. From their equipment, it could be seen that these soldiers did not completely rely on long-range weapons. They seemed to be more proficient in close-range combat such as high-powered submachine guns and stilettos. When these soldiers' seemingly ordinary bodies faintly exerted force, under the thin material of their military uniforms, the lines of their muscles could be clearly seen moving. It was hard to imagine what kind of amazing power was hidden under these thin military uniforms. At this time, Li Feng was standing beside a dark green military vehicle dozens of meters away, looking at these guys with cold eyes. 2 days ago, he had lost his command authority, but for some strange reason, the military did not restrict him from moving with Small I's combat force. Betting on my military discipline and sense of honor, more than my hatred for you guys. Li Feng thought silently, then turned his attention back to the soldiers. He had never liked Su Lu, but he did not want this guy to die for some very disgusting reason. Looking at these tough soldiers, Li Feng began to worry about Su Li's safety, which was rare for him. He was very familiar with these soldiers, or rather, he was very familiar with the special temperament and strength of these soldiers, because when he was very young, he also trained in the Philadelphia Training Hall. These soldiers were all from Philadelphia, and they were all valiant figures who had been trained in the body cultivation hall. People like them were often hired by big families as bodyguards, such as Li Xiaodong's brother Zhang and Lin Dohai's Kong Wu. Li Feng licked his lips, and his eyes showed a violent emotion. The federal military had sent out the real elites. Could that guy withstand it? Inside the independent building, the members of Small Eye's command center had a nervous and anxious look on their faces. The gunshots on the spaceport had not sounded for a long time, which made the string in their hearts extremely tight. They had begun to believe that the seemingly foolproof judgment was actually just a mistake. Then, where was Su Lu at this time, and what was he going to do? Reporting back all targets. The high-ranking official of the Federation Investigation Bureau wiped the sweat on his forehead and roared angrily, "Where the hell is that guy?" With the sound of the system reporting back, the people in the room confirmed that the President's residence, the Bureau of Proclamation, the 1st Military Region Headquarters, and the military court were all safe. The more than 20 suspicious targets of the Federation government agencies reported back that there were no abnormalities. The security of the agencies jointly undertaken by the Capital Police Division and the Iron 7th Division had not been challenged at the moment. Activate the second bait. The official walked in front of the light screen and ordered the members in a deep voice, "Pick up Colonel Lake at the military court and immediately take him to the prearranged residence. The intelligence team will send the address of the residence to Macho Back Mountain as soon as possible." If Su Lu did not choose Jin Chaoda, then he was most likely to choose Lake. Since the military court was clean, then they would kill him on the road or in that residence. Chapter 782. The slender high-heeled shoes slid across the red carpet and landed on the wooden floor, making a clicking sound. It sounded like someone was knocking on a door. Su Lu, who was under the wooden floor, slowly opened his eyes and woke up. There was no light in his eyes, and the narrow space was filled with darkness. He could faintly hear voices coming from above, so he knew that the court was about to start. He had been lying quietly in the dark and narrow space for 4 days and 4 nights without food or water. If he knew that Nan Xiangmei was worried about him in the manor, he would definitely tell her that he didn't eat or sleep well these days. The true power that he had broken through in the Imperial Hospital ushered in the most difficult test. The power, or true qi, that flowed slowly in his muscles and body without any obstacles, miraculously helped him slow down the frequency of his heartbeat and breathing. His metabolism entered a state similar to hibernation or deep sleep. After waking up, every muscle in his body slowly relaxed. Even the smooth muscles that couldn't be controlled by the brain also relaxed. His breathing and heartbeat began to return to normal. The footsteps above the darkness became more and more frequent, and the voices became louder and louder. Su Lu squinted his eyes very hard. He looked into the darkness, but through the surveillance camera in the corner of the court-martial, he could clearly see everything in the hall. This feeling of being completely separated from his body was very strange. It was as if he was looking down at some lowly existence from above. Su Lu didn't like this feeling, but he needed a line of sight. In fact, in order to obtain the surveillance footage of the court-martial, he had countless fierce disputes with the Federal Central Computer in the dark. The modified H-14 sniper rifle was on his left shoulder, the high firepower Langer pistol was on his right, and the military knife he made himself was on his left calf. After 4 days and 4 nights with his slightly warm body, it was no longer cold, and the target he wanted to kill was on the floor. The court-martial was very quiet. There weren't many people participating in this secret trial. In addition to the military and government representatives, 2 representatives of the Zhong family from the West Woods were invited. However, the 2 middle-aged men obviously didn't have any negative opinions about the explosion of the antique bell. In the current situation, they relied on the support of the Federation government, so it was impossible for them to have any negative opinions. Su Songzi calmly looked at the case file on the table. Minister Zhou was suspended, and the situation had changed drastically. She and her colleagues, who belonged to the legal department of the Ministry of National Defense, already knew that today's secret trial was just a formality. However, she insisted on being the main controller and wore her most beautiful green dress. She got up and walked to the control panel. Her beautiful slender heels stepped on the floor and made a clicking sound. It sounded like she was knocking on the door, but also like some kind of countdown time machine. Su Songzi slightly bowed to the high courtroom and ignored the people in the gallery. She calmly looked at the accused wearing a strapless military uniform and said calmly, "Colonel Lake, you are accused of participating in a murder case in the 67th year of the Constitution and illegally stealing the secret data of the Bureau of Proclamation in the 69th year of the Constitution. You are accused of illegally stealing and leaking important data of the Federation. You are accused of destroying the Federation's first-class aircraft, endangering public safety by dangerous means, and violating the Federation's military data regulations." There was no evidence to be presented, nor was there any court debate. The trial today didn't need any witnesses. Su Songzi sadly lowered her head and quietly pressed the thick file. Then she took a deep breath, raised her head and continued calmly, "I will accuse you of intending to subvert the Federation. I will accuse you of collaborating with the enemy. I will accuse you of treason. I will accuse you of murdering the commander of the Federation's Westwoods military region, Zhong Suahu, and his wife, as well as 1372 Federation soldiers on board in the 70th year of the Constitution. I will ask the military court to sentence you to 7 death sentences, to be shot. Just like the hearing half a year ago in the building opposite the official residence, Su Songzi repeated the stormy and severe accusations of that day. However, her tone was much calmer today because she only insisted on stating the charges. She didn't expect to receive a fair trial at all. Colonel Lake, standing in the dock, didn't argue, nor did he roar angrily like he did that day. He calmly looked at Su Songzi, and there was even a faint trace of mockery on his face. The military court trial ended abruptly. The judge declared Colonel Lake not guilty on the pretext that there wasn't enough evidence and released him in court. No one in the courtroom was surprised by this result, including Su Songzi and the officers from the legal department of the Ministry of Defense. They couldn't even show their anger in front of people. They could only pack up the case file and walk out of the courtroom along the red-carpeted corridor. At that moment, Su Songzi felt that the red carpet under her high heels seemed to become extremely wet, as if it was soaked in countless amounts of blood. The people who came to watch the trial left the military court one by one. Their expressions were either calm or tired, but in short, they all had a sense of righteousness. No one expressed anger or sadness about today's shameful trial. In order to prevent the crowded and chaotic entrance from being used by the dangerous person lurking in the dark, a division of the Iron 7th Division that was specifically in charge of security today asked Colonel Lake to stay at the end of the courtroom. A few minutes later, the courtroom had become much emptier. Colonel Lake, who was handcuffed by the bailiff, smiled and shook hands with several government officials. He then received a brand new military uniform and put it on carefully. He believed that before long, there would be a dazzling gold star on the shoulder of this military uniform. Stepping on the bright red carpet with his shiny black shoes, Colonel Lake took a deep breath and suppressed the complicated and inexplicable emotions in his heart. He gently pressed down the hair fluttering under the brim of his military cap with 4 fingers and stepped out of the courtroom. The bulletproof car team stopped at the bottom of the stone steps. The elite soldiers from the Iron 7th Division vigilantly watched the periphery. As long as he walked out of the courtroom, he would usher in a new life. As for the past glory or sin, it would only be the proof of his firm belief. A smile full of confidence, perseverance, calmness, and even beginning to appear elegant appeared on Colonel Lake's face. He embarked on the path of a new life. At this moment, the red-carpeted road suddenly changed shape and bulged in front of Colonel Lake. It was as if an incredible micromovement of the Earth's crust was taking place in this military court. The terrifying power of the deformed road turned the hard wooden floor under the carpet into countless pieces of debris. The red carpet on top was directly torn into countless pieces of tattered cloth that fluttered in the air, looking very much like the tattered clothes of the soldiers who had died on the battlefield. No one could react in time. Except for Colonel Lake himself, the people inside and outside the courtroom had no time to see this frightening scene. The torn red rags made a hissing sound and hit Colonel Lake's body and face. The pain was like countless shiny slaps. In the shadows of the rags, Su Li's figure appeared. He held the high-powered Langer pistol in his hand and directly pressed it against Lake's jaw, which had not fully opened in this chaotic scene. Lake's eyes widened. He recognized the face in front of him. In fact, he was probably the first person in the federal military to know Su Li. He also clearly felt the hardness of the gun muzzle on his jaw. In fact, many years ago, he had fiercely aimed at the person in front of him with the hard gun barrel. The gun barrel against his jaw was not cold, but it was so cold when it was about to come. There was absolutely no accident. The pieces of the red carpet flew all over the sky, right in front of his eyes, and occupied all his vision. It was like the blood on the battlefield, the blood of his comrades. In the moment before death, Colonel Lake seemed to see the grandest and most shameless fireworks. He saw the Westwood soldiers running and screaming on the ancient bell. He saw the face he wanted to forget but could not remember the most, the thin and charming face of the commander. At this moment, he wanted to say something, perhaps to repent. His voice was hoarse. Su Li was no stranger to Colonel Lake. It was this person and the mecha unit he led that ended his life as an orphan repairman. In fact, from a certain point of view, his escape and the things he did in this universe were all related to this person. But at this moment, there was no need to lament about history and the past. He was here for revenge, or rather, he was here to carry out his own trial. Colonel Lake only had time to say one word before the high-powered Langer pistol made a muffled sound. The high-powered bullet shot into Colonel Lake's jaw, penetrated his slightly open palate, broke through the adhesive tissue behind his nose that he was trying to take a deep breath, and quickly killed his brain that might still be preparing to repent. In the end, it tore through the occipital bone behind his head, which was more protruding than normal people's, and flew out with a whistling sound. The bullet blasted off the entire back of his head. The grayish-white sticky brain matter mixed with dark red blood spurted out from the terrifying hole and splashed on the dignified and righteous judgment platform behind him. It was a mess. Su Li burst out from the ground and pulled the trigger while aiming at Colonel Lake's jaw. It was actually just a moment, not more than 1 second. Lake only had time to say one word. There was a pair of deep eye sockets on his thin cheeks. His narrowed eyes were calm. Su Li silently thought in his heart, I won't forgive a single one of you, and I won't give you a chance to repent. In the process of thinking this, he didn't look at Lake's body that was slowly falling down. The Langer pistol in his hand fired 2 consecutive shots to the side, hitting the right shoulder of 2 Iron 7th Division soldiers, shattering their shoulder bones into pieces. In an instant, a powerful force flowed into his tired legs. Between the spray of smoke and the flying pieces of the red carpet, Su Li jumped onto the judgment platform and broke through the wide floor-to-ceiling glass behind him. Concentrated gunshots rang out. Colonel Lake was charged with many crimes and was asked to be sentenced to 7 death sentences and executed by shooting. The Federation's military court ruled that he was not guilty. Su Li killed someone in court and was executed by shooting. Chapter 783. When the intense gunshots rang out in the courtroom, Su Li had already smashed through the floor-to-ceiling window and was falling to the hard ground outside the building with glass shards flying everywhere. The soldiers of the Iron 7th Division blasted the courtroom bench into countless pieces, leaving countless deep marks on the walls, but they could no longer penetrate the walls and hit his body that was adjusting his posture at high speed. When the Iron 7th Division troops in charge of security outside the courtroom heard the gunshots, Su Li's feet, which were wearing special military boots, had already landed heavily on the ground. Unlike ordinary Special Forces soldiers, he didn't roll forward to reduce the huge impact. Instead, he directly resisted the recoil of the ground with the strong muscle fibers under the skin of his legs. Using the few tenths of a second he saved, he quickly rushed forward more than 20 meters. The wall of the courtroom was right in front of him. The Longar high firepower pistol in his right hand quickly fired at the walls around him. The purely mechanical trigger mechanism, under the pull of his index finger, which was like a steel spring, bounced up and down at an astonishing speed. In a very short period of time, he fired 23 times at high speed, completing a pistol rapid-fire demonstration that could definitely be written into the federal military textbooks. Bang! Bang! The vintage red bricks on the wall shattered one after another, as if countless deep bullet holes had appeared out of nowhere. As the bricks and debris flew everywhere, the soldiers on the first line of defense fell to the ground one after another. They didn't even have time to make any shooting movements, and most of them didn't even have time to turn around. After the initial moment of surprise, the troops outside the courtroom quickly made an efficient mobile response. They were Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division, and had excellent military training that was unimaginable to ordinary troops. However, Su Li's terrifying speed at this time was faster than their reaction. In just 1 or 2 breaths, while the injured soldiers on the first line were still falling in the autumn wind, his figure had already jumped over the wall, stepped on the lawn, and ran toward the dense forest on the west side of Robbie Avenue. The 24 bullets in the Langer high firepower handgun's magazine were all used up. While running, Su Li's right hand loosened. When the magazine slid to the side of his waist, the modified H-14 sniper rifle on his left shoulder was already tightly gripped in his hands. This continuous tactical movement was done in one go, and it did not affect his speed at all. All the strength in his body was mobilized, especially the muscle fibers in his legs, which were rubbing and squeezing at high speed. Accompanied by the familiar trembling and sour feeling, it provided him with a strong support of strength and speed. The special military boots on the soles of his feet were beginning to be unable to withstand the force of the high-speed sprint between his body and the ground. The surface of the boots was mottled and cracked, and it was possible that they would fall apart in the next moment. Su Li, who was running on the lawn, was like a roaring high-speed car. The human body did not pay attention to aerodynamics. He directly and violently pushed the air that was beginning to become viscous to the side, causing the withered leaves on the lawn and the slightly dry soil in the grass to explode. It looked like his body was directly stirring up a cloud of dust. The courtyard wall fell behind him, the lawn was under his feet, and the dense forest was right in front of him. The 3 lines of defense of the Iron 7th Division were directly penetrated by Su Li with his inhuman speed. The soldiers were moving at high speed in this direction. If one were to look at the current situation from the air, it would seem that the man running madly with the cloud of dust was like an arrowhead, forcibly pulling the circular defense of the Iron 7th Division into a triangular area. A shrill whistle cut through the air above the lawn, sounding dangerously. Following that, more gunshots rang out. Some bullets brushed past Su Li's calf while he was running, shooting deep into the slightly dry soil. The dense forest was right in front of him. It did not seem to be far, but the 2nd and 3rd lines of defense of the Iron 7th Division had quickly gathered and began to use fierce firepower to seal off the lawn. The moment the dense gunshots suddenly rang out from all directions, Su Li, who was holding the gun with both hands and running with his head down, immediately recognized the guns used by the troops. The muffled sound of the muffled muzzles represented high-powered mid-range hard sniper rifles that could easily blow his waist in half. As he ran at high speed, the slightly cool autumn air gradually turned into a frozen river that slapped against his face. Su narrowed his eyes, but it was not because the annoying autumn wind disturbed his vision. It was just a habitual action when facing the greatest danger. His eyes were abnormally bright, like the sun hanging above the dense forest. In front of the dense forest, Su-Li's right foot stomped heavily on the lawn. Because the dry and hard grass suddenly became deeply deformed, the military boots on his right foot finally could not withstand the enormous force and directly shattered. Even the thick sweatpants on his calf were directly torn apart by the sudden expansion of his leg muscles, and a few cracks appeared amidst the ripping sounds. Using the huge rebound force from the soles of his feet, Su-Li flew up at this moment, his body drawing a strange arc in the air as he ascended. A few bullets dangerously brushed past the soles of his feet. If his dodging action had been detected by the enemy, or if his speed had been 20% slower, these few bullets would have definitely hit his body accurately. The dense forest was cut into pieces by the dense rain of bullets, flying everywhere under the red sunset. In front of this peaceful and beautiful scene of the battlefield, Su-Li forcibly twisted his body in the air and retreated towards the dense forest at high speed, the H-14 in his hand switched to a sniper rifle and fiercely opened fire. At this moment, he retreated in the sky full of broken leaves, the gun in his hand spitting out beautiful flames. It was as if time and gravity had lost their effect, and the movement of everything had become slow. Only the sound of deformation could be heard, the mixture of dull and crisp, echoing between the lawn and the dense forest. Countless cold metal bullet shells were ejected from the side of the gun and slowly fell to the ground. Su-Li retreated in the air for about less than a second. In this short period of time, while he was unable to stand firmly in the air, he completed the action of raising his gun, looking for a target, and pulling the trigger. What was really incredible was that he completed this action 6 times in a row, launching 6 accurate shots at the firing points of the Iron 7th Division's defensive line. If it was said that the rapid firing of the pistol when he rushed out of the courtroom could be perfectly written into the textbooks of the federal military, then the backward sniping and continuous shooting technique that Su-Li displayed at this moment was completely a template that ordinary soldiers would not be able to learn. This was because no one had the strength and terrifying reaction speed that he had. Pooh! 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 Around the courtroom, 6 firing points that were not in the same area were hit by Su-Li's precise shots. The modified H-14 sniper rifle perfectly adapted to this terrifying rate of fire, and the large-caliber bullets mercilessly penetrated the temporary workers and hit the fastest elite shooters of the Iron 7th Division. The dense gunshots suddenly became sparse, but Su-Li, who was falling, still narrowed his eyes. His gaze was bright, and his left hand pressed the button on the spare magazine on his belt, and he whispered, "I'm going to die." After landing on the lawn, even though they had entered the dense forest, they were still in the area between the 2nd and 3rd line of defense of the Iron 7th Division. The few elite shooters closest to them were already lying in pools of blood, but there were more soldiers in the distance. The military quality of the Iron 7th Division's troops was unquestionable. They would definitely not charge blindly. Instead, they would choose to use the temporary workers and terrain, as well as the real firepower of their guns, to force Su-Li into a desperate situation. Although Su-Li had a pair of mechanic's sharp eyes, and his eyesight was better than before after the breakthrough in the Empire, he still could not capture all the blind spots around him and see every dangerous enemy. It was impossible for him to rely on a modified H-14 to suppress or eliminate the enemy in the midst of the smoke and falling leaves, because he was not the omnipotent God of creation. Only the omniscient could be omnipotent. Landing heavily on the lawn, Su-Li's movements did not slow down at all. He quickly retreated into the forest, his hands holding the H-14 steadily in front of his eyes. He aimed at the enemy's firing points that he could see clearly, and he pulled the trigger continuously without hesitation, emptying the magazine of bullets. Across the lawn, on both sides of the forest, and even behind him, the gunshots that had just stopped for a moment rang out intensely again. Su Li's thin face flashed with a trace of ruthlessness, and he roared angrily, "I'm going to die." No one knew why Su Li yelled angrily at the empty lawn at the most dangerous moment. Could it be that if you said to Sunset that you were going to die, you wouldn't die? The modified H-14 did not make any noise, but Su Li clearly knew that the magazine had been emptied. His left hand took out the spare magazine at lightning speed, and his right thumb pulled the empty magazine out with force, completing the action of reloading at a speed that was almost impossible to be seen clearly by the naked eye. With a crisp click, the magazine accurately entered the H-14. Following this sound, it was as if a switch had been turned on. The chip at the back of his neck heated up slightly, and on the screen full of bullets from Sunset and no falling leaves, countless grids instantly appeared, as well as countless precise images of human bodies with citizen numbers hanging on them. Whether it was in the shooting range, hiding behind the forest, hiding in the depths of the grass, or hiding in the high court, the positions of all the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division accurately appeared on his retina. Even the scene behind him, which was completely invisible to the naked eye, entered his eyes through some kind of strange imaging method. He could even see the precise coordinates of these targets and the extremely detailed simulated human body composition. Su Li was no stranger to these scenes. Back then, when he was in a desperate situation at the Four Prefectures Foundation building, when he was surrounded by the Imperial Army in the forest at 3320, when the creatures died, he could see this scene that was completely different from the real world. There was no smoke or blood, only the smell of a shooting game. The charter network that covered every inch of the Federation's land presented these images in front of his eyes using countless military satellites and ubiquitous surveillance systems. There seemed to be a faint sigh in Su Li's mind, but he did not pay attention to it. He silently raised his gun and quickly pulled the trigger. He did not need to aim, nor did he need to hesitate. Because from this moment on, there was nothing he did not know and nothing he could not do. Chapter 784. Turning sideways, turning around, half-squatting, and shifting to the right, a clear, mechanical, and even somewhat cold voice was transmitted into Su Li's brain. When the long-distance sniper bullets flew over from the other end of the forest, these sounds would ring out. Because it was a function of a certain sensory region in his brain, the speed was very fast, and he would meticulously listen to the command, accurately and quickly completing these very basic movements to avoid fatal danger. Most of the time, Su Li just stood there, holding his H-14 horizontally as he switched to sniping in all directions. He calmly pulled the trigger, standing between the green grass and yellow leaves, standing in the increasingly strong autumn wind, moving the muzzle left and right at high speed. Occasionally, he would turn around and look at the shadows behind him, firing rapidly at an unimaginable speed. Along with the crisp and continuous sound of the rifle being fired, the sound of people falling to the ground could be heard from time to time. In the fortifications behind the trees, the high-speed shrapnel would occasionally cause blood to splatter everywhere. The troops trained by Du Shaoqing were strong and professional, far more difficult to deal with than the Empire team in the Golden Foundation building and on base 3320. The soldiers around seemed to know that Su Li had a terrifying remote positioning ability, so they immediately reacted very effectively and began to move quickly between the fortifications and the dense forest. Su Li was not moved. He still stood silently among the fallen leaves, calmly and accurately shooting in all directions. Smoke and dust rose from dozens of clear bullet points, as if they were all hit at the same time. Grass and soil splashed, blood and muffled groans mixed together, and bullets flew mercilessly. In the area between the military court and Robbie Avenue, the soldiers tried to make a heroic and accurate counterattack, but they were always disintegrated under the terrifying shooting of the H-14. The H-14 seemed to have some kind of magic in his hands, and the bullets did not stop for a moment. In addition to the ability given by the glory of the charter, a large part of the reason was that the speed at which he pulled the trigger and reloaded exceeded the maximum limit in the tactical manual. The high-speed rotating bullet seemed to have its own cold vision, cutting through the air in a straight line and accurately hitting all the targets. Sulo actually used the gun in his hand to suppress more than 20 soldiers of the Iron 7th Division nearby. Standing at the edge of the forest, he only needed to avoid the sniper from afar. As for the sniper on top of the court building, he had already misfired from his first round of terrifying continuous shots. Dozens of meters away, a second lieutenant of the Iron 7th Division bravely dashed out from behind the wall. Ignoring Su Li's strange and terrifying shooting, he pulled the trigger as fast as he could. Then, a burst of blood burst out from his left shoulder as the bullet pierced through and knocked him to the ground. With a muffled sound, Su Li's left chest was hit by a bullet. His body trembled, and his face turned pale for a moment before returning to normal. He did not lower his head to look at the shrapnel that was deeply embedded in the hard ceramic bulletproof vest, nor did he pay attention to the pain caused by his cracked ribs. Instead, he followed the powerful impact of the bullet and took a step back. Step by step, he retreated into the dense forest behind him. His shooting posture did not change at all. Sulu silently and calmly pulled the trigger around him, and the crisp sound of gunfire rang out. The birds in the autumn forest were stunned by the dense gunfire. It was only when they heard the footsteps of the man below becoming more and more hurried and gentle that they came back to their senses. They fluttered their wings and flew into the sunset when the Iron 7th Division's T Company, who were responsible for security, finally succeeded in closing the defense line and gathering at the edge of the dense forest. There was no trace of Sulu. There were only broken branches hanging in the air, and broken leaves and grass fluttering weakly in the autumn wind. The battle outside the court-martial lasted less than 2 minutes. Sulu had used up all the magazines he had on him. In the end, even the specially made gun barrel could not withstand the wear and tear and began to become unstable. The Iron 7th Division side, in the post-battle summary, was very angry to find that their ammunition yield was pitifully low. It wasn't that the soldiers weren't brave enough and didn't dare to fight back because they were suppressed by the enemy's violent gunfire. It was just that the 30 or so Iron 7 Division soldiers in this area didn't have a better way to deal with the terrifying gunfire that would cause blood to splatter everywhere. After careful calculations, the powerful command center of the government made overall arrangements. This reinforced company, which had made outstanding military achievements on the front line, was mainly defending the periphery of the court-martial. No one had expected Sulu to be hiding under the passage of the court-martial. With a targeted defense arrangement, they were naturally caught off guard by the violent surprise attack from the inner circle. In fact, if it was not the Iron 7th Division's T Company who was responsible for the defense of the court-martial today, but any other federal forces, they would not have done a better job. It was very likely that when Sulu broke into the dense forest with a gun, the other troops would not even have time to fire a shot. Several bulletproof black government service vehicles sped up from the other end of the court-martial. With the sharp sound of brakes, 2 deep footprints appeared on the lawn that had just calmed down a little. A high-ranking officer with a solemn expression and an angry man walked out. They were the members of the Small Eyes unit who were originally supposed to be responsible for picking up Colonel Riker. Biederman looked at the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division in front of him, waved his arms angrily, and screamed, "You were in charge of the court-martial. I'm here to pick up Riker. Now Riker is dead. Where's Sulu? You pieces of trash." This genius former employee of the Bureau of Proclamation had spent a lot of money to convince his superiors to allow him to leave the building and come to the court-martial because he firmly believed that Su Li's target was definitely the second bait. To be able to see a Federation hero die in front of him with his own eyes was undoubtedly the most wonderful thing for him. But he did not expect that Su Lu would not act as the Small Eyes unit had speculated. Instead, he would use such a violent and direct method to end Colonel Riker's life in the court-martial. The strong climax he had expected turned into an unprecedented disappointment and humiliation. Biderman was extremely angry. T Company was a reinforced company of the Iron 7th Division that was very good at fighting. For this secret security mission, the commander in charge was even a battalion commander. In his hand was the 21-26 long sniper rifle that he had snatched from his subordinates. It was obvious that he had also personally participated in the battle. Hearing this extremely fast cursing, the battalion commander turned around with a sullen face and stared at the guy in front of him who he did not recognize, who was jumping around like a monkey. After a moment of silence, he directly pulled out the pistol at his waist and pointed it between the other's eyebrows. Biderman's body suddenly trembled, and the swear words in his mouth came to an abrupt stop. The high-ranking officer who had gotten off the car with him nervously blocked the gun. From the wrist of the battalion commander holding the gun and the indifferent gaze in his eyes, he could clearly tell that if he had moved a little slower, the other party would definitely have dared to shoot. He was the captain of the Special Forces of the 3rd Military Region, and now the highest commander of the Small Eyes unit. Of course, his rank was much higher than that of an ordinary battalion commander, but he did not want to have any conflict with Division Commander Dushouching's subordinates. Also from S3, he knew very well that although the Iron-Faced Division Commander valued discipline, he was also very protective of his subordinates. "I solemnly apologize to you and your unit on his behalf," the commander said in a low voice. As a military officer, he could understand the emotions of the other party after experiencing a particularly vexing battle. The figures of several medical helicopters gradually became clearer in the air. South of Robbie Avenue, the ambulances of the military-affiliated hospital were also rapidly approaching. For some reason, these ambulances did not flash or siren. Report, 24 seriously injured, no dead. Hearing the report, the battalion commander's expression was a little surprised, but he finally relaxed a little. Without even looking at the pale Biderman, he walked to the other side of the lawn where the injured soldiers were gathered. Under the setting sun, the helicopters slowly landed, and the wind blew. A second lieutenant covered in blood was carried onto a stretcher and was ready to be sent into the cabin door. The battalion commander looked at his most capable company commander and confirmed that he was conscious, so he should not be in danger. He smiled and patted his shoulder. In the previous battle, the bullets of the snipers of the Iron 7th Division's T Company had grazed the target's body, but in a close-range shooting, only this person had bravely shot Su Li's chest. The second lieutenant on the stretcher took a burning cigarette. The fingers on his left hand trembled because of the severe pain from the bullet wound, the handsome eyebrows on his pale cheeks knitted together. He looked at the battalion commander and said in a hoarse voice, "Boss, this battle is very uncomfortable. I don't accept it." The battalion commander did not say anything. He waved his hand and asked the medical officer and subordinates to push the stretcher into the cabin door of the helicopter, and then began to treat the other injured subordinates on the lawn. During this process, his facial expression gradually stiffened, because he found that the gunshot wounds on the soldiers had one thing in common: they were all on the right shoulder. The only soldier who was seriously injured in the left shoulder by shrapnel was used to holding the gun with his left hand. The standard bulletproof vests of the Federal Forces could cover the entire body, even including the neck, but for the sake of flexibility in combat, there was no protection for the shoulders. Colonel Su Lu, who had already proven his valiant military qualities on the battlefield, naturally knew this. However, if he could guarantee that every shot he fired would hit the enemy's shoulder, why didn't he choose to shoot the head? Even if he was wearing an infantryman's helmet, the obviously modified H-14 sniper rifle in his hand could directly break the neck of the soldiers with terrifying momentum. Battle was a cold contest of life and death. Even if the enemy only had one breath left, it could still cause fatal injuries. There was never such a thing as mercy on the battlefield. However, the battalion commander of the Iron 7th Division turned around and looked at the dense forest that had already quieted down, his gaze extremely complicated. At a remote intersection a few kilometers away from the dense forest, in the blind spot of the surveillance camera, as the last warmth of the setting sun left the cold city, an old metal door valve was slowly closing. In the underground sewer, Su Li's right hand held the wet wall as he struggled to walk into the darkness. Blood began to seep out of his left leg, but there was a calm smile on his face. Chapter 785. Hiding under the floorboards for 4 days and 4 nights, he probably didn't eat or even drink. So I don't understand how this person survived. Not only did he not die of hunger or thirst, but his combat ability didn't seem to be affected at all. Although the soldiers of the Iron 7th Division look very rude, everyone knows that they can't make mistakes when inspecting the battlefield. Since they use life detectors to check the military court in advance, why didn't they find Su Li hiding under the floorboards? Inside the only building in the capital special district that had 3 layers of information blocking, a member of the small-eyed troop pointed at the information on the light screen angrily and helplessly. He waved his arms helplessly and said in a low voice, "How do we explain all this? Unless we admit that he's not a human." Of course he's not a human. Another member shook his head in disappointment. He looked at the battlefield surveillance that had started to play and said, "He's so strong and invincible, how can he be a normal human? Give up on these useless literary sentiments. No superpower creatures have been found in the universe so far." The official of the Federation Investigation Bureau interrupted everyone's behavior to vent their disappointment and shock. He said in a deep voice, "The most important task now is that we have to figure out where Su Li's next target is. Even if we can't set up an ambush, we have to ensure the safety of those big shots. Now the statistics show that the possible targets of Colonel Su Li's attack have expanded to 37. It's very difficult to choose the key targets to protect from among them." The member in charge of the intelligence analysis scratched his head and cursed in a low voice. He looked at the people and said, "The Federation has offended too many government agencies and big shots that have offended Colonel Su Li. That guy is psychopathic. He always feels that the whole world has wronged him. Professor Nur, you should support my judgment." Sitting in the corner, Bateman said to the famous psychology professor of the small-eyed troop. His eyes were bloodshot and his feet were placed on the table casually. He seemed to be playing some kind of video game that required high IQ. Only his trembling fingers and the sarcasm in his words showed the real anger and unwillingness in his heart at this time. The members in the room all thought that Biderman was the real psychopath. They also knew what had happened to him in the military court, so they remained silent. This silence made Biderman feel even more humiliated. He threw away the video game controller, stood up and roared at everyone, "Don't you understand? Psychological analysis, criminal history research, combat strength assessment, all of that is bullshit. It's all fucking shit. We know that guy has the glory of the charter on him. That omnipotent broken computer is on his side. We even know how they work, but what's the use of that? There is only one key point to solve this problem. Authority. Authority. And it was still authority. If we don't strip him of his authority, no one can do anything to that damned rat." Biderman's cheeks were flushed red. Like an actor in an emotional theater, he shook all the joints in his body in an exaggerated manner. Blue veins popped out on his neck, which was white due to the lack of sunlight. The people in the room were still silent. They knew that Biderman was right, but no one could strip Su Li of the First Order authority. No, it was even more inexplicable than the First Order authority. Although this special department named Small Eyes had the highest authority of Mr. President and could even directly deploy combat troops, it was impossible for them to rush into the Bureau of Proclamation building and blow up the Federal Central Computer. In fact, they didn't even dare to think about it. Let's give up our illusions and face reality, everyone. The senior official looked at Biderman and sighed. He pointed to the information on the light screen and said, according to the analysis of the combat data that Su Lu has participated in, as well as the assassination in the military court, we can clearly judge that before he carries out any seemingly risky action, he will make ample preparations in terms of equipment and mental strength. He shrugged and said, it takes time to arrange equipment, obtain relevant information, and formulate a target. I believe that Su Lu will enter a long period of silence, which also means that we can take a rest, take a bath, or something. This is probably the only good news we have today. There was a series of chair legs moving and a series of tired yawns in the room. The official finally added, according to the instructions of the superiors, what happened in the military court today must be kept absolutely confidential. A member replied sarcastically, being locked in this building every day, there is no way to sell the news to the reporters. These experts began to stretch their waists, and some directly went back to the living area to take a bath and have a meal. At this time, the door painted with the pattern of small eyes with red pupils was pushed open, and several soldiers walked in with serious expressions. Biderman was picking up the game controller again with a gloomy expression, but was shocked to hear the task given to him by these soldiers. He stood up angrily, looked at the senior official, and protested, looking at the picture consumes too much of my mental strength. Maybe I will live 10 years less. The official calmly said, this is the price you promised to pay when you strongly requested to go to the military court. Biderman was stunned. He stuck out his red tongue and licked his lips. The 30-year-old him smiled innocently and evilly like a child. He said in a sharp voice, if I can really kill that guy, it is worth it to lose 10 years of my life. Hidden behind a chaotic vegetable market somewhere in the capital special district, there was a black market that sold wild meat. This black market, through certain connections, accepted the dead wild animals from the private hunting grounds of the big shots in the suburbs, and then cut them up and sold them here. Although the HTD Bureau was well aware of this, because of certain reasons, they kept silent. At this time, it was already late at night, and the small amount of wild meat was sold out in the evening, so compared to the vegetable market in front of it, it was particularly quiet. In the corner of the underground sewer, a metal valve suddenly began to silently turn, and a head quietly appeared. The surveillance camera here had long been removed because the owner was worried that it would be recorded as illegal evidence, so no one could see this somewhat strange scene. After a simple dressing in the warm nest with a freezer and a TV deep in the underground tunnel, Sula changed into a clean and fresh set of clothes and returned to the surface. Passing through the underground passage where a fierce battle had occurred a few days ago, he looked at the small department store in the foothill on the sloping stone path. After hesitating for a moment, he gave up the original plan, worried that the government's investigation would cause trouble for boss Xiaoshan. In a shop on the street, he bought a phone that was neither cheap nor expensive, and then dialed a number. On the third floor of the presidential residence, the phone beside Miss Padil's pillow rang. Now that it was difficult to fall asleep with the big stuffed bear in her arms, she slowly turned her head and looked nervously for a long time before answering the call. She said one word in a thin and trembling voice. Hello. Miss Padil, your father is holding a very important meeting, and it is not convenient to disturb him at this time. You know, Mr. President needs to work for the benefit of many, many people, right? Outside the retro door of the Oval Office, a special task force agent in a black suit politely but firmly stopped Miss Padil's request to enter. Padil was wearing a nightgown, barefoot, and her right hand hanging by her waist tightly holding the phone. She stared at the agent, and it seemed that she had no intention of giving up. Take the miss back to sleep. How do you do your job? The agent stared gloomily at the waitress who followed the miss nervously and reprimanded in a low voice. Padil suddenly took a deep breath, then squatted down slightly and screamed loudly with no expression on her face. The girl's sharp scream echoed in the official residence, and the agents and waiters suddenly panicked, not knowing how to deal with it. The entire Federation knew that the first daughter had suffered from autism when she was a child, and her condition had only improved in the past 2 years. The staff in the official residence had always been very protective of her. The heavy door of the office opened, and President Pobre at the end of the round table stood up with a smile and said to the government ministers at the table, "It seems that the emergency meeting must be suspended. It seems that our little fish has more urgent problems than the Federation's affairs that need me to solve." There was a burst of understanding or appropriate laughter from the big shots at the round table. "Dear little fish, why aren't you sleeping at this late hour? Is there something important?" The corners of President Pobre's eyes clearly showed fatigue, but he still squatted to ensure that he was at the same height as his daughter and asked gently. "It's Sue Lee's call." Padil handed the phone to her father. Because of nervousness, it was very wet. Everyone knew the situation of the first daughter of the Federation. Although her condition was gradually improving, she basically didn't speak in front of outsiders. At this time, the 5 words she said were so clear that it was shocking. However, what was even more shocking was the content of her words. The people in the Oval Office stood up in shock. The security department quickly responded, and the intelligence team immediately began to track the source of the signal. Hearing his daughter's words, President Pobre's body stiffened slightly, but he still looked at her and smiled. Then he slowly straightened up, put the phone to his lips, and said, "Colonel Sue Lo, I don't appreciate your actions." The person on the other end of the phone should understand where Mr. President's anger came from. It wasn't about Colonel Lake's death, but because this call affected his sick daughter. Sue Lee's tired voice came from the other end of the phone. "I'm sorry, Mr. President. This is the only way I can find you." President Pobre waved his hand and signaled for the agent to take his daughter away. The retro door quickly closed, covering Padil's delicate and pretty little face. At this moment, the government officials stood nervously around the round table in astonishment. Chui Jedong was deep in the Bureau of Proclamation, staring at the light screen on which the data was constantly flowing. Li Jae-do was in his office with his deep-set eyes closed, thinking about an important problem. President Pobre clenched his daughter's phone, his knuckles protruding angrily. The intelligence team made a signal connection. Sue Lee's voice began to echo in the Oval Office, which represented the power of the Federation. It echoed in the ears of these big shots who controlled the fate of the Federation. These words were also said to those who weren't present. The old man once said that some people will always be swept into the dustbin of history. Shi Qinghai said that garbage doesn't walk into the dustbin by itself, and we need to sweep it. Now I agree with the latter. Mr. President, I think many of the things you've said before are very reasonable. In fact, when it comes to debating and persuading people, no one in the entire Federation can do better than you. So today, I'm not calling to debate with you, but to inform you of something. After a very short pause, the voice sounded again in the office. I don't know why I'm fighting, but I've already started my battle. In the city under the night sky, Sulu looked at the majestic and magnificent Parliament Hill not far away. He narrowed his eyes, hung up the phone in his hand, crushed it into a ball of scrap iron, and threw it into the dustbin beside him. Chapter 786. The Oval Office was silent. The officials looked at President Pobre with complicated expressions. No one dared to speak. After a long period of silence, the president put the phone on the table. His movements were very slow. When the phone made contact with the table, there was no sound. Only the veins on the back of his hand showed his true anger at the moment. In the Ministry of Finance building, I had a long conversation with Colonel Su Lo. Before I entered the alloy door, the special task force tried to stop me because they were worried about my personal safety. President Pobrecht suddenly said something that surprised everyone. There was no emotion on his tanned face, and his voice was particularly low in the Oval Office. At that time, I said that when Colonel Su Lo wanted to kill me, it meant that I really should die. He put his hands on the table, and his broad shoulders were as stable as usual. There was a complicated smile on his face. It was hard to tell whether it was self-deprecating or mocking. Now that I think about it, this joke was probably not that funny. The president waved his right hand tiredly. The officials in the Oval Office understood and hastily ended the report on the attack on the military court that afternoon. They quickly left. The director of the office, Breen, pushed open the heavy retro door and walked in. He looked at the president's tired back with a complicated expression. After hesitating for a moment, he walked up and said softly, "Mr. President, we just got the election poll. Your support rate has increased by 1%. Before he finished speaking, President Pobrecht stood up straight and waved his right arm hard. His usual deep and charming voice became particularly irritable at this moment. Public opinion, public opinion, public opinion. What's the use of these things? The president immediately reacted to his rare loss of composure. After a moment of silence, he patted the shoulder of the shocked Director Breen and said in a low voice, "Sorry, I'm in a bad mood today." "It's okay." Director Breen forced a smile and followed the president's gaze to the cute pink phone on the table. He frowned and said, "I'll immediately inform the intelligence team to cut off Mrs. Communication Authority." No need. President Pobrecht had calmed down by this time. He waved his hand tiredly and said, "I believe Su Lo will call again." According to some sources, this Councilman Jean Chota should have established contact with the official residents a long time ago, but no one knows what kind of agreement they have. It was quiet in the Lufeng Slope clubhouse. Mr. Zion, the vice president of the Federation, took a sip of the expensive red wine and gently stroked his gray hair. He was talking to the lady across the table in a reserved and polite manner. "Thank you for your hard work today." Lady Tai looked at the old man with a smile and said casually, "After Mr. Byron left us, you have to bear a lot more responsibilities. You should take care of yourself." He knew what his wife meant by hard work. Regarding the welcome ceremony at the airport, he only needed to make 2 phone calls to successfully divert the attention of the government agencies. In a sense, the military court attack case, which was still under absolute secrecy, was deeply related to him. The old man didn't know what kind of deal or tacit understanding between Lady Tai and the feared colonel. In fact, he wasn't going to ask. Every big shot had their own secrets, especially when it came to such a big issue. However, the madam's seemingly casual words made the temperature of his heart rise slightly. After a long silence, he raised his head and calmly said, "But it is very clear that Mr. President does not seem to want to resolve this matter before the election. According to the relevant regulations of the Federation Constitution, when the President of the Federation government died unexpectedly or was unable to perform his duties for other reasons, the Vice President would take over. In this case, the Vice President would be replaced by the Vice President of the Management Committee. It had been a long time since Vice President Byron was killed by Shi Qinghai. The major forces of the Federation had been urging President Pobrecht to complete the replacement process as soon as possible, and let Vice President Xian take over as the Vice President of the Federation. However, the official residents had always claimed that the replacement process was postponed until after the election because of the war and the approaching election. Lady Tai didn't seem to expect that the experienced and astute politician sitting across the table would choose such a direct way of conversation. After being stunned for a moment, she smiled and looked at a secluded corner of the table downstairs, saying something that seemed to be completely unrelated. "A few days ago, Colonel Su-lo had dinner at that table. Her wife looked at that place calmly and said, "Now many people in the Federation hope that he can serve a sumptuous dinner." Vice President Xian tasted the red wine in his glass calmly, but he wasn't as calm as he appeared to be. He knew what his wife was implying, but when he thought of that possibility and the possibility of his feet stepping into that white official residence, the light and mellow red wine seemed to become countless times stronger in an instant, burning his throat after it entered. In the past few years, when I tried to teach the little guy some setbacks, I myself suffered a great setback. That's because there were two real mountains behind him, the old man and Mr. President. Lady Tai said, "Now that the old man is gone, Mr. President has become his biggest enemy. I'm very curious to see what kind of trouble he can stir up in such a difficult situation." However, the feedback in the past few days seems to indicate that his ability and determination to stir up trouble have exceeded my imagination. Vice President Xian stroked the white hair on his forehead again, tasting the burning sensation of the precious red wine on his lips and tongue carefully. He let out a slight sigh of satisfaction, thinking silently with a smile that the bigger the trouble, the better. The edge of the bathtub with metal feet was carved with porcelain flowers. Although it wasn't comfortable to touch, it looked very luxurious. The water in the bathtub was boiling hot, with steam rolling out. Su-lo held a glass of red wine in his right hand. Most of his body was immersed in the water, but his skin didn't show any trace of burning red. All the fatigue quickly leaked out through the expanded pores. He drank a mouthful of red wine, sinking a little more into the water, and couldn't help but let out a sigh of satisfaction. The door of the bathroom was tightly shut, isolating the ringing of the office phone and the sound of automatic printing. The window facing the building was open, and the cool autumn wind poured in from Charter Square, bringing with it hot steam that filled the air, blurring the vision of the surroundings. Sometimes, blurring was synonymous with relaxation. Su-li's sharp eyes could easily see through the mist, looking at the scenery of the square outside the window. The wound on his leg was healing quickly. The temperature of the water was intoxicating, and the glass of red wine in his right hand hanging by the side of the bathtub was also intoxicating. The scenery of the square was also intoxicating. At this time, although the fatigue in his body had been completely squeezed out, the tiredness in his mind was uncontrollably rising. Su-lo narrowed his eyes, looking through the layers of hot mist at the square shrouded in the night. He looked at the bronze statue of the quintet, and looked at the old man who was still sitting in the cockpit of the M37 mecha even after his death. He raised his glass of red wine and toasted him from a distance, softly muttering to himself, "Old man, I'm sorry I couldn't do what I promised you. I really like being a cleaner." Then, his body and mind completely relaxed, and he fell into a deep sleep in the bathtub. "I'm quite dissatisfied with your work during this period of time." Councilman Jean Choda paced quickly beside the table, as if he wanted to use these actions to calm his anger. He suddenly stood still, pointed a finger, and reprimanded in a deep voice, "The organization gave you such an important job to work in this decaying building. This is a very rare trust, and what did you do? I order you to complete the handover of the 4 departments in the shortest time possible, and then return to the mountain for debriefing." The old man's finger was about to touch that pair of black-rimmed glasses, appearing particularly rude and forceful. As the second most important person in the anti-government army of Green Dragon Mountain, this kind of behavior towards a subordinate was only natural. However, to the surprise of the old man and the soldiers who came with him from Green Dragon Mountain, not only did the owner of the black-rimmed glasses not immediately apologize, even her expression was so calm. Zhang Xiaomeng slowly extended her right index finger and pushed up the black-rimmed glasses on the bridge of her nose. She looked at the old man and calmly said, "Councilman comrade, I want to know the reason." Jean Choda could clearly feel that she, who was standing in front of him, had a kind of calmness that came from the depths of her heart. The old man knew that only a person with a strong enough heart could show absolute calmness. A sense of vigilance arose in his heart, and he slowly said in a deep voice, "Do you want me to carefully repeat the process of that little fish's death?" The old man's voice was incomparably cold. He had presided over many bloody internal cleansing operations, so his body exuded a kind of terrifying aura from inside out. In Green Dragon Mountain, countless people secretly hated him, but no one dared to show this kind of emotion in front of him, because coldness and ruthlessness were often the most powerful weapons to intimidate people. "This is an internal operation of the 4 departments, I don't think there is anything to explain to you," Zhang Xiaoming calmly said. Since she already knew the purpose of the councilman, she even directly omitted the honorific. The people in the room fell into absolute shock, including the female employee with the coquettish figure. Everyone looked at Zhang Xiaoming in disbelief, not knowing how she dared to talk to the councilman in such a tone. The emotions in the eyes of Councilman Jean Choda were particularly gloomy. He stared at the beautiful face in front of him, and said very slowly with a voice as thin as the tongue of a poisonous snake, "The stupid people in the Federation call you the leaf of Green Dragon Mountain. Do you think that with this beautiful face, you can do whatever you want? Don't forget that it was the organization that trained you, and you are working under my direct leadership. Councilman Comrade, I want to correct you on one point, I work directly for the organization." After a moment of silence, Zhang Xiaoming calmly looked into the old man's eyes and said with a smile, "This is my see, unless the committee passes a resolution, no one can take away my see." Chapter 787. Jean Choda coldly stared at her face. 3 years ago, he had seen her beside the person he hated the most. However, at that time, she was still a very ordinary woman. Other than being very beautiful, there was nothing special about her. However, today, Zhang Xiaoming led Green Dragon Mountain's most important intelligence network within the Federation. Both her temperament and willpower had undergone a shocking change. Such a large piece of the deep sea is not something that can be owned by just one person. The old man slightly bowed. His oppressive gaze penetrated the glasses and stared into her eyes. He said, "You are at most a fisherman. Under my will, the biggest fish in this sea will easily die. The female fisherman will also not have any accidents." Zhang Xiaoming slightly raised her face and replied with a smile, "Comrade member, you must be tired after such a long journey. I am ready to accept the official decision of the committee at any time. If there is nothing else, I will take my leave first. You still have to give a formal speech in the committee tomorrow. As for the fairy tale of the sea and the fisherman, we can talk about it another time." A very calm reply, but contained a very firm will. Zhang Xiaoming lightly pushed the black-rimmed glasses on her nose again. She slightly nodded to Jean Choda and prepared to turn around and leave. Just as her hand touched the smooth door handle, the old committee member's slightly hoarse but vicious voice sounded again behind her. "I heard that your ex-boyfriend has already started a war with the Federation government. The organization needs the relevant information. In addition, if there is a chance, we are very happy to see him die. I believe you also understand that this is the organization's test for you." The people in the room could see Zhang Xiaoming's back. Just from the back, she did not have any strange reaction after hearing these words. However, no one could see the sharp light that flashed through that pair of black-rimmed glasses. After Zhang Xiaoming left, the Green Dragon Mountain soldiers in charge of protecting committee member Jean Choda also left, leaving behind 2 people to guard the door. Even if these elite soldiers of the mountain were to die, they would not let anyone harm the leader in the room. Committee member Jean Choda looked at the tightly closed door. A strange smile suddenly appeared on his old and gloomy face. He said mockingly to the woman beside him, "If Su Lo comes to kill me and is killed by me, President Pabre will definitely like the gift I gave him. Tell me, can this gift and this deep sea be exchanged for the position of Vice President of the Federation?" This most loyal female subordinate of his was at a mature and attractive age. A trace of nervousness flashed across her beautiful face. She said with a trembling voice, "Of course, there is no problem." Jean Chota turned around and coldly looked at her chest. What a stupid and timid woman, but what he needed after the great reconciliation between the Federation government and Green Dragon Mountain. Parliament Hill passed a bill to open up a row of rooms in the building specifically for Green Dragon Mountain's office in the capital. As the spokesperson of the anti-government forces in the Federation, Zhang Xiaomeng had an office suite with a living room. In this luxurious suite of Parliament Hill, she secretly presided over the work of Green Dragon Mountain's 4 departments. She looked at the sea that no one knew the depth of. She received the gift from Linhai province from her subordinate. She originally thought that it was another piece of jewelry sent by Hai Qingzhou and was about to have her subordinate send it back. Unexpectedly, she saw the scribbled but unique signature. She couldn't help but smile because she recognized that it was the handwriting of that university professor's father. She had returned to the Federation for a long time. Her relationship with her family had improved tremendously. Her parents, who had a high social status, no longer angrily scolded her for her life choices. Occasionally, they would even send some warm gifts. However, they were still worried about her marriage. After closing the door, Zhang Xiaomeng opened the box. She found a very cute silver bear pendant. She guessed that it was a gift that her mother had chosen. She smiled and connected it to the electronic key chain in her hand. Then she kicked off her high heels and casually put them on a pair of soft fluffy dog slippers. The living room behind the office was her personal space. Without permission, no one could enter. In fact, no one had been able to enter for the past 2 years. She turned on the TV screen. After changing into her pajamas, she tiredly rubbed her hair and leaned against the sofa. She casually picked up a bag of dog biscuits and began to chew. The more she chewed, the stiffer her cheeks became. She seemed to be filled with anger. In a low voice, she cursed, "You old perverted dog, you actually want to steal this old lady's things." She was the famous Green Dragon Mountain's leaf. In front of the Federation people, she was a calm and amiable spokesperson. In front of the government officials, she was a calm and oppressive negotiator. In front of her subordinates, she was an extremely efficient manager. In the hearts of the spies in the deep sea, she was the coldest and most ruthless leader. However, in this space that belonged only to her, she was hugging the bag of biscuits. Her feet were on the table, and her eyes were fixed on the TV screen. Her hair was disheveled, and she was talking nonsense. She was like an ordinary woman who had just had her expensive bag stolen by her love rival. Zhang Xiaomeng did not think that her life was full of sorrow. She had never hugged a pillow and cried in the middle of the night, or cried alone on the sofa in front of the TV. Therefore, when she saw the glasses gradually blurring, she did not think that it was because of her own eyes. She quietly put down the dog biscuit. Her face was unusually calm, but a light silver pistol had appeared in her right hand at some unknown time. She slowly stood up and turned around, walking towards the bathroom that was slowly emitting traces of heat. The dog-headed slippers on her feet were hung with fine velvet, and they did not make a single sound when she stepped on the carpet. She pushed open the bathroom door, and the cold muzzle of the gun passed through the steaming steam in the shortest time possible. It was pointed at the man who was sleeping soundly in the bathtub. Her arms suddenly stiffened, and then she slowly put down the gun in her hand. Slowly and hesitantly, she walked over. Zhang Xiaomeng stood in the steaming steam and quietly looked at the man sleeping in the bathtub. Suddenly, she took off the black-rimmed glasses on the bridge of her nose. It was not because the glasses were misted, but because she knew that he did not like them. She squatted down and tilted her head slightly to look at him in the bathtub. She did not know when he had come, nor did she know what he was thinking in his sleep. He was smiling so happily like a child. Although the government had completely blocked the news of the military court attack, she knew what the man in the bathtub had done in the afternoon. At this most dangerous time, he was in his own room, sleeping so soundly in his own bathtub. What kind of trust did this represent? Zhang Xiaomeng squatted beside the bathtub and looked at him quietly. She looked at him for a very long time. Then, she reached out her fingers and slid them across his smooth forehead and straight nose, across his single eyelid, across his thin lips, across his collarbone, and across his naked body that was covered with old scars. Happiness and satisfaction filled her mind, making her smile happily and shyly. She did not know why, but her eyes became a little moist. Suddenly, she quickly combed her hair with her fingers. Her movements were particularly frantic. Although the man in the bathtub was sleeping soundly, she still did not want to appear in front of him with her hair disheveled. She put away the pistol, tied up her ponytail, and squatted beside the bathtub again to carefully look at the man's face. After a long time, perhaps because the bathroom was too hot, 2 faint blushes appeared on her cheeks. She did not know where she got the courage, but she lowered her head and gently kissed his thin lips. Slightly dizzy, Zhang Xiaomeng nervously held onto the smooth edge of the bathtub with both hands. Her slender fingers were very strong as she struggled to maintain her balance. Su Lo woke up. He opened his small eyes and looked at the hot steam in the room and the girl's face that was inches away from him. He saw the panic that flashed across her eyes and felt the softness on his lips. He did not understand what had happened. The bathroom was too hot, and the steam filled it, blurring all of his memories. If time was really a cruel carving knife, then the sculpture under the knife was, at least at this moment, blurry. The light kiss that was like a dragonfly touching water instantly turned into a subconscious rubbing of the lips, and then it quickly turned into a passionate kiss. The wet tongue clumsily joined the battle. Someone lost their balance and fell into the bathtub that was as warm and deep as the sea. As if they were afraid that they would not be able to hold on to the rope that would save their lives, the two tried their best to hold on to each other and began to roll in the water. Waves of hot water overflowed the edge of the bathtub painted with porcelain flowers. It was as if they had returned to the snowy campus and the lonely iron tower during the new year. They flipped over and over again, but it had been a long time since they had seen snow by the Rose River. God knows how many batches of boys had come to deliver porridge and flowers to the girls' dormitory. The current life of the two people in the water had been separated from the normal world for too long. But perhaps because of this, their desire to return to the past was so strong in the rippling waves. After a long time, the two of them slowly separated. They looked at each other without saying a word. After a few silly laughs, Zhang Xiaomeng suddenly reacted and scrambled out of the bathtub. Her movements were very clumsy, just like her reaction earlier. I brought a bottle of red wine and drank a glass. It tastes good, do you want some? Su Lo looked awkwardly at the girl who was dripping water and took the bottle of red wine beside the bathtub. Okay, but I think you should be in need of something to eat right now. Zhang Xiaomeng walked out of the bathroom and took a wine glass. Then she looked awkwardly at Su Lo and said, "But I think I only have biscuits here." Su Lo scratched his head with a smile and asked, "Puppies?" "Yes." Zhang Xiaomeng made a soft sound with a nasal sound. Her pajamas were already soaked and stuck to her body, but she did not escape. She just lowered her head a little and water droplets kept dripping from the ends of her wet hair. Looking at the bathtub that took up 2/3 of the bathroom, she hesitated for a moment and gently bit her red and tender lower lip. Holding the wine glass in one hand and the biscuit bag in the other, she stepped into the bathtub and carefully sat at the end furthest away from Su Lo. Chapter 788. The perfect life insurance system of Parliament Hill automatically changed the hot water in the bathtub. As the water vapor rose, Su Lo and Zhang Xiaomeng sat at opposite ends of the bathtub, munching on crispy dog biscuits and drinking mellow red wine as they talked about their past. That year on the balcony of the Lufeng Slope clubhouse, the two hugged and then parted. They occasionally contacted each other, but that was no longer the case. It was unknown if Zhang Xiaomeng still felt sorry for him, but Su Le had long since become indifferent to many things. What was indifferent was unwillingness, anger, or frustration. What was indifferent was the youthful feelings that began with the misunderstanding on the spaceport bus in the 65th year of the constitutional era. The conversation continued in this calm and warm atmosphere. Su Le talked about the little dreams he once had, the little dreams related to Zhang Xiaomeng. He talked about how he got into a big company to become an engineer, how he bought a small house with the bank card and salary his uncle left him, how he got married and had children. He also talked about how he felt after his dreams disappeared without a trace. He talked about the deaths he saw on the battlefield of the Empire in the West Woods. He even mentioned the sadness he felt when he thought Zhang Xiaomeng had died, and the many stories that began because of this sadness. The keywords in these stories were the development of the MX Mecha, director Lin Yuanhu, Senator Medellin, the presidential election, and other shocking terms. It was just as a proverb in the Federation said, behind every new tycoon is a heartless first love. Although Zhang Xiaomeng could not be said to be heartless back then, the stories that had happened to Su Le over the years could be considered magnificent. It had to be said that they were all related to her in some way. This was a one-sided conversation. Su Le kept talking in a low voice. Perhaps it was because he had never had the chance to talk before, and he didn't know if he would be alive to talk about it in the future, so he cherished this opportunity very much. While he was talking, Zhang Xiaomeng basically didn't make a sound. She just held the glass of red wine and looked at his face attentively. It was as if she wanted to remember this ordinary face deeper and deeper so that she would never forget it. Zhang Xiaomeng suddenly looked at him seriously and said softly, "Let's make love." Su Le looked at her, not knowing what to say. "I know you have a girlfriend, but let's make love," Zhang Xiaomeng said softly as she looked down at the red wine in her glass. After 4 days of enduring the tiredness, hunger, and thirst, and then soaking in the hot water room for one night, Su Le was in good spirits, but he was not in the best state mentally. Suddenly hearing the girl's voice from the other side of the mist, he was silent for a long time. He did not give a positive answer to the word love, but asked in a low voice, "Why? You can die at any time. Just leave me a memento, okay? Or leave a son for yourself." Zhang Xiaomeng lowered her head and clumsily tried to find an excuse. Then, she took a sip of red wine, put down the glass in her hand, and slowly unbuttoned her soaked pajamas. Like a naked fish, she slid into the water and swam to the opposite shore. Su Le wanted to explain, but his lips were blocked by a rose. Her trembling tongue mixed with the slightly astringent red wine. At this moment, she didn't explain. She just wanted to make love with him. She just wanted to make love. After a long time, the two of them floated to the surface of the water, hugging each other. They leaned against the soft cotton bed, panting slightly. Su Le held her in his arms and was silent for a long time. Then, he said softly, "You are my second woman." Zhang Xiaomeng slowly closed her eyes, and a smile appeared on her lips. There was no satisfaction of a woman's possession, nor was there the pride of stealing someone's fruit. There was only calmness and gratitude in her smile. She said softly, "You are my second man too." It was like the conversation between the gatekeeper and the Iron Tower in Yue University. There was no fundamental change. In the dim night, Su Le was silent for a long time. Then, he asked the same question as before, "Is it too short?" The darkness before dawn was the deepest darkness. Su Le woke up in bed. His squinted eyes were exceptionally bright. He tried to get out of bed, but he woke up the woman in his arms. No one turned on the lights. Looking at Su Lo, who was silently getting dressed, Zhang Xiaomeng hugged the corner of the blanket. She gently bit the corner of her lips and asked, "I didn't think you would really dare to hide in the Parliament Hill for a night. Uncle once said that the most dangerous place is the safest place." Su Li's fingers forcefully arranged the gun so that the mechanical parts did not make any noise. After a short pause, he said, "This sentence can't be trusted more than 3 times. This is the 2nd time." Zhang Xiaomeng was no longer the Zhang Xiaomeng of the past. She understood some things in a very short time. Looking at his back, she smiled and said, "Don't feel sorry for anyone. You are now fighting with your life on the line. You have some privileges." Then, she stood up and stood in front of him naked. She carefully helped him arrange his clothes. She tidied his collar very neatly, stood on her tiptoes, and whispered the room number in his ear. Then, she walked him to the door. Outside the window, the first ray of the willow dawn finally welcomed the first ray of sunlight. It shone on her naked body. Her beautiful curves glowed seductively. She smiled and said calmly, "Be careful." The whole process seemed very natural. She was like a wife sending her husband off to war. The front line was not far away, right in this building. Perhaps she knew that this was the only chance, so she did it very seriously. There was a cute silver bear pendant hanging on the key ring beside the door. Unfortunately, the man who left would not have the chance to use this ring of keys to open this house again. That in the morning, a loud shout suddenly broke out in the building in the capital special district. The sleepy members of the Small Eyes department were all startled awake. They saw the criminal investigation expert with red eyes excitedly waving a note full of words in his hand and shouting, "We were wrong. We didn't have the terrible patience of an engineer, and we didn't have the time to prepare and adjust the equipment." "What are you talking about?" the people who were woken up asked angrily. "We all forgot the most famous case, the revenge of a small character from morning to night. Have you all forgotten how he killed Duke Carlton back then?" The expert looked at the watch on his wrist and shouted, "It's been more than 14 hours since Lake's death. Su Lu must be carrying out the second plan at this time." The most dangerous place was the safe place. No matter how strong a fortress was, it would always be breached from the inside in the end. Su Lu firmly remembered these seemingly ordinary words and firmly put them into practice with the help of the old man. It was the same when he executed Lake in the military court, and it was also the same when he walked inside Parliament Hill. With a light crisp sound similar to that of breaking branches, the pistol with a silencer sprayed out bullets. Although the 2 elite soldiers guarding the door had been vigilantly watching the 2 ends of the corridor, they could not react at all in front of Su Li's imaginable speed. 2 blossoms of blood burst out of their bodies, and they fell down with a muffled groan. Su Lu crossed his feet and swept over with the wind. He added 2 knife hand strikes to the back of their necks to ensure that they could not resist at all. He raised his head and glanced at the surveillance cameras that were everywhere inside Parliament Hill. The Federal Central Computer refused to help turn off the surveillance equipment in Parliament Hill because the damned 3 core laws had taken the upper hand in its psychological battle this time. Without the old man, Su Lu still had other means, such as the little thing that was emitting a faint blue light in his backpack. Other than the oldest physical lock, there was no lock in this society that could stop him, the most brilliant mechanic. With a light click, the door marked 2046, which represented the Federation Management Committee's cultural and artistic category, quietly opened. After entering the bedroom, Jean Chowda, who was on the bed, woke up earlier than expected. As the person in charge of Green Dragon Mountain's internal cleansing, he had some kind of innate sensitivity to danger, probably because he had been hated too much. Looking at the man in hooded sportswear at the door, the face under the shadow of the hat, and the cold gun in his hand, Jean Chowda did not panic, nor did he feel any despair. He raised his hand to comb his messy white hair with an expressionless face, and then rudely pushed away the woman beside him who was already trembling in fear, and picked up a thick stick of tobacco from the table. "Young man, calm down." Jean Chowda was already old. When he woke up from his sleep, he spoke with a spittle. He cut off the end of the thick tobacco, lit it, and took 2 deep puffs. He coughed and said, "Since you didn't open fire immediately, it means that your sensitivity is beyond my imagination." Sula silently raised the gun and aimed at the space between his eyebrows, but did not pull the trigger. According to his personality and way of doing things, since he had decided to kill this big shot of Green Dragon Mountain to avenge Mr. Sure, he would never be like the male lead in a movie, giving the other party too much time to talk nonsense, even if it was to repent. However, just as he was about to pull the trigger and end the other party's life, the old man, who had been silent all night, suddenly issued a clear warning. There was a problem with the ring on the other party's finger, which was emitting an uninterrupted wave signal. Jean Chowda leaned against the headboard and calmly smoked his tobacco. He raised his right hand and looked at the brand new ring. He said, "I like to deal with smart people. Otherwise, if the other party can't see through my plan and stupidly kill me, and at the same time kill the people he cares about, then everyone will be very unhappy. Right now, there should be a silver bear pendant in Zhang Xiaoming's room, or even next to her." The old man coughed twice and calmly explained, "That is a very beautiful bomb, so beautiful that if an expert didn't tell me, I wouldn't be able to see it." He reached out his finger and shook the ring. He looked at Su Lu and smiled. "The ring is the trigger. It has a physiological response. As long as there are changes in the pulse, microvascular pressure, temperature, and other physiological data, which means that I am dead, then it will automatically remote control the explosion to kill that proud fisherwoman." Chapter 789. "You don't have to think about knocking me out instead of killing me." The old man stroked the surface of the ring as if he was stroking a woman's skin. He added coldly, "It only needs to be pressed lightly to have the same effect." In the shadow of the sports coat, Sulu narrowed his eyes. When he left, he did see a silver bear pendant next to the door. At that time, he even had the impulse to put the bunch of keys in his pocket. His steady and strong index finger pressed the mechanical trigger a little deeper. Just a little more and it would be fired. He asked, "And then?" "And then? I just want to tell you stupid young people who don't know how vast the universe is. We old people have gone through a lot of bloodshed to get this little bit of status, and you want to take it away so easily." Smoke spread around Jean Chowda's face. The old wrinkles on his face were angry and mocking. "Bait? Kill me. Young man, do you know who I am? I've killed more people than you've ever seen. Do you think I dare to wait for you to kill me without any preparation and just bring a few soldiers with me?" "Be more direct," said Su Lu. Jean Chowda's face was a mixture of gloominess and excitement. His empty left hand rubbed the plump buttocks of the woman beside him, completely ignoring that his loyal and stupid subordinate was trembling in fear. "A normal person would probably only ask you to leave at this time." The old man laughed hoarsely and said, "But even I don't think I'm normal. I don't want to be the vice president of the Federation government in the future and have to worry about being assassinated by you all the time. So, I want you to die." Sulu had always thought that there was only one kind of enemy in the world that was the most difficult to deal with, and that was the madman, such as the great teacher in the white courtyard of the empire. At this time, he saw another old man who was just as crazy, and this old man was even more cruel and cold. Cold sweat gradually seeped into the back of his clothes. He was nervous at first, but then he became calmer. He, who had the thickest nerves in the universe, had this special ability. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the old man who was close to him. He quickly calculated how likely it was to knock him out before he could activate the device and how likely it was to completely destroy the nervous system in his right hand with a bullet. Charter's computer was also silently calculating. It was much faster than him and gave back a few extremely accurate values. The values were quite high. If placed on the battlefield, it would be enough to take a risk. However, Sulu did not move. He was not gambling with his own life, but with the life of the girl who had just tidied his collar. Amidst the suffocating atmosphere, the charter computer once again sent out a warning to his brain. The silent alarm system of Parliament Hill had already rung, and the powerful organizations of the government had begun to gather. According to the calculations, he had less than 5 minutes left. Sulu took a deep breath. His slightly squinted eyes suddenly brightened. The shadow under the brim of his hat instantly disappeared, and the scorching power behind his waist violently spread throughout his body. However, just as he was about to take the risk and make a move, 2 gorgeous saber lights suddenly flashed by the bedside. The first saber cut off the upper half of Jinchoda's hand that was coldly extended in the air. The second saber simply stabbed into his shriveled ribs. Pfft. 5 fingers were neatly severed like a fence that had been sliced by a bullet. Blood gushed out from the wound. The sudden intense pain caused Jinchoda's expression to change drastically. However, the miserable cry that was about to leave his mouth was abruptly cut off by the saber that had stabbed deep into his ribs, slicing open his lungs and piercing through his heart. The sharp saber accurately and coldly pierced through his heart membrane, causing blood to splatter from the inside of the old man's body into his lungs. An instinctive physiological reaction caused him to start coughing violently. There was no way for him to let out a miserable cry. Su Li's attention was completely focused on the 5 severed fingers flying in the air. His feelings of despair and frustration caused his reaction to slow down for a moment. He could only watch as a white and clean hand reached over and lightly grasped the severed finger with a ring on it. The woman in her 30s held the severed finger in one hand and a delicate saber in the other. No one would have thought that this delicate saber would be able to release the 2 cold and gorgeous saber lights. Just as no one would have thought that this gorgeous and vulgar woman, who was trembling in fear a moment ago as Jinchoda coldly rubbed her buttocks, would do such a thing in the next moment. This woman seemed to believe in Su Li's ability to control his emotions. She completely ignored the black barrel of the gun that was aimed at her. She lowered her head with a focused expression, quickly took off the ring from the severed finger that was oozing blood, and put it on her thumb. Then she raised her head, looked at Su Li, and calmly explained, "Comrade, you don't know. This kind of sensor has a delay period of 1 second. When Su Li heard this sentence, his facial expression didn't change at all. However, the burning power that was poured into the muscle fibers of his legs gradually dissipated. The ring had already been put on the woman's finger. And it was obvious that this woman was very difficult to deal with. Even if he knew that there was a delay period of 1 second, he wasn't confident that he could take it away. The woman noticed his nervousness, smiled and got up from the bed. She pulled the hem of her nightgown like a lady, but the white and plump chest was even more obvious. She walked in front of Su Li, took off the ring, and handed it over to him. Su Li took the ring and quickly put it on, but he didn't take back the gun. He was still aiming at the woman. The woman smiled and didn't care about his vigilance. She walked back to the bed with a serious expression. Comrade Jinchoda was lying on the bed, his eyes filled with fear and confusion. He powerlessly looked at the blood on the messy bed and his 4 severed fingers. He wanted to use his left hand to grab his right hand that was constantly bleeding, but he couldn't move it at all. His white hair was disheveled and wet, covering his forehead. This old man that countless people of Green Dragon Mountain secretly hated to the bone appeared unprecedentedly desolate. Within his old and shriveled body, in a place invisible to the naked eye, his heart was unceasingly spurting out blood, pouring into the 2 punctured lung lobes. The blood entered his lungs, causing him to cough violently. Blood with saliva foam splashed out of his pale lips from time to time. The old man moved his eyes with great difficulty, staring at the woman beside the bed. It was as if this was the first time he was seeing this woman who had been with him for a long time, who was usually very stupid and vulgar. Jean Chota was already unable to speak. The woman looked at the man who was coughing and said seriously, "This is the latest order from the committee. The leader of Southern Water told me to tell you that the organization only needs loyal members." Hearing these words, hearing the words leader of Southern Water, the comrade who was about to become the Federation's vice president showed incomparable fear in his eyes. His shriveled body twitched twice on the bed, and he stopped breathing in despair. Sulu looked at the woman's back and slowly put down the gun. He asked, "You can kill him at any time. Why do you have to choose now?" The woman turned around. The serious expression on her face had already disappeared, returning to a charming and timid appearance. She explained in a soft voice, "If the Federation's people think that this is another bloody power struggle within the organization, it will damage the reputation of the committee and the leader of Southern Water. Therefore, you have to be the scapegoat." Suluk shrugged and replied, "I'm happy to do so." Before leaving, he turned around and looked at the woman who was preparing to go under the bed to complete her role. He asked curiously, "May I know your name or code name?" Chapter 790. Zhang Xiaomeng picked up a phone call in the morning light. Her expression didn't change much, but her bare toes that were stepping on the soft carpet subconsciously shrank back. This imperceptible action revealed her true feelings at the moment. She casually put on a thin shirt and put on her black-rimmed glasses. She walked to the door and looked at the silver bear pendant thoughtfully. After a while, the silver bear pendant was opened, revealing a simple and ugly abdomen. There was nothing inside. She smiled and shook her head. She sighed with emotion and reminiscence. The sea that her teacher left for her was deeper and deeper than she had imagined. Sirens sounded outside the Parliament Hill building. She walked to the window and lifted a corner of the curtain. She calmly looked out. Dozens of police cars were approaching at high speed, and a group of fully armed Federation special forces had begun to rush up the stone steps. The people doing their morning exercises in Charter Square looked over in shock, and the streets were filled with a scene of panic and noise. She just quietly looked into the distance. She looked at the back of the man who was disappearing into the autumn ginkgo trees and silently wished him good luck. When the Federation Special Forces entered the Parliament Hill and began to inspect floor by floor, Sulu had already returned to the damp and dark underground sewer from the surface. It was a long process to walk to number 3 Lindy. His leg injury hadn't completely healed, so he felt pain with every step he took. However, there was no expression of pain or forbearance on his face. Instead, there was a faint smile on his face. These smiles grew more and more until they couldn't hold it in anymore. They snatched a passage from his lips in the exhaust duct of an underground water treatment system. First, there was a burst of laughter, and then it was extremely loud and joyful laughter. The laughter penetrated into the wide exhaust duct, and then it was pushed back at an even faster speed by the huge air pressure on the surface. It hit the inner wall of the sewer made of composite water-resistant materials, fell to the ground, and shattered into pieces. Back and forth, it became more and more distant and clear. Colonel Lake was dead, and the big shot from Green Dragon Mountain who had betrayed Shi Qinghai had also died because of a betrayal. Sulu had long agreed with Professor Shen's point of view. There was no reason in this universe. However, looking at this kind of karma that seemed to be destined by fate, he felt that it was very interesting. His exhausted chest was overflowing with incomparable satisfaction and joy. The joy from inside out turned into laughter that reverberated back to his eardrums. It was as if it had become some sort of driving force that made his legs, which felt like they were filled with lead, suddenly feel much lighter. The red-tinted maintenance sensor lights lit up one by one with his gentle footsteps and then extinguished. It was just like the feeling when the old man had used the musical fountain to create momentum for him on the beach of the villa. Back then, on the beach of Buu Mountain Villa, the sound of the musical fountain had sent him to Lin Dao Hai and the 7 great families behind him to show his attitude and strength. Today, these dim red lights, as well as the lingering sounds of laughter, sent him to battle. To fight against the most powerful regime in Constellation and win. What is the horse stance? Why is it called the horse stance? Su Le had once asked this question to the uncle beside the mine, but he could only get a rough brush of coarse tobacco and a scolding filled with mockery. After he grew up, he had looked it up in the library of Heshi State University. After he fled to the Capitol Ring, he had even studied the beginner's manual of Philadelphia's Body Cultivation Hall. However, he had never obtained an accurate answer. So, he bent his knees, lowered his hips, and retracted his chrysanthemum. Just as the uncle had said, he imagined the feeling of being soaked in warm water in the most luxurious recuperation center in Bell Tower Street and being gently caressed by the smooth skin of 5 naked breasts. He slowly captured every trace of strange trembling in his muscles, whether it was numbness or tearing pain. In the end, it would turn into the sour trembling after extreme exhaustion. He did this when he was beside the abandoned mine in Donglin. He did this when he was in the dark gatehouse of Yue University. He did this when he was in the prison cell of Fox Fortress and Allure Military Prison. He did this when he was in the military camp. He did this when he was in Wangdu Youth Apartments. He also did this when he was in the Empire's Tianjing Planet slums. It seemed that he had been doing the horse stance every day since he knocked on the door of the repair shop. As long as the environment allowed, Su Le would do this kind of boring work every day. He was especially serious and strict. It was as if he was designing the composition of a machine. He did not allow for the slightest mistake. It was because he knew that this was the greatest thing he relied on to survive. It was also the source of many things that he could do and find a lot of happiness. This had already become the most indispensable part of his life. The habit gradually became instinct. As long as he thought about it in his mind, the part below his waist would become like cast iron with just a thought. Even in the most terrifying of storms, he would not waver for a moment. It was just like how he was in the corner of the underground sewer. He changed the dark red repair sensor lamp to a low-temperature light bulb, which was more suitable for the long-term needs of human eyes. The faint light shone on his half-squatting shadow on the wall. There was no change in the shadow for as long as 40 minutes. It was as if the shadow was going to be carved into the wet wall. Suddenly, he made a move. He simply extended his left hand forward, raised his right arm, and inserted it diagonally into his left armpit. The tip of his palm slowly but firmly extended upwards, all the way past his earlobes and hair. In the end, he actually circled around his head and touched his right ear. This was a movement that seemed simple, but was actually very difficult. It had extremely strict requirements for the human body's extensibility. In fact, when he was a teenager and completed this movement for the first time after 4 days of hard work, his bones were much softer and were about to fall apart. His right shoulder joint had been severely strained. Now, it was very easy for him to do this movement again. There was no sound from his joints. He maintained this strange posture for a long time until sweat began to ooze out between his right hand and his right ear. Su Le changed his hand and did this movement again. Then it was the second and third positions. The last positions were slightly more complicated, but compared to the body training techniques of the federal military and even the Philadelphia Body Training Hall, they were still too simple. But with these 10 simple positions, he could easily and casually complete an extremely sharp attack with every bone in his body, every pair of muscle fibers, and every thick nerve. It was as if they were instinctive. More importantly, these positions had been slowly and exceptionally effective in destroying the mysterious power in his body. It was the true chi that the old man in white chow shirt talked about. After completing the seemingly simple 10 positions, Su Lu was already sweating profusely. The only military green underwear on his body was already soaked. After a few slow and long breaths, he took a towel and casually wiped himself. Then, he began to prepare his dinner. He was heavily injured in the military court battle. Although the shrapnel in his leg had already been removed, the injury was still there. In the early morning in the building of Parliament Hill, although he did not experience a fierce battle, his energy consumption was even greater. Facing the woman with the codename Deep Sea, even he became very tired under some kind of extremely dangerous pressure. According to Li Pifu's opinion, the 10 positions that Uncle Feng Yu passed on to him, apart from their own magical effects, were mostly designed specifically for the Lis of Philadelphia. But for Su Lu, he was more used to using these positions to train and recover his spirit and suppress his injuries. His past combat experience had already proven that this was more reliable than medicine and sweet sleep. On the ground, it should be the time when the autumn sun was broken. Su Lu began his dinner. There was a large amount of food on the table of the temporary Camp 3. If a normal person saw it, they would definitely not believe that it was only his portion. He had already consumed a lot of the nutrition bars. The rest would be left for continuous undercover battles in the future. Tonight's dinner, apart from his favorite raw fish, was more fatty food. Fighting with such a terrifying ability would consume a terrifying amount of energy. In order to avoid the miserable situation where one's stomach would rumble like a drum or even become dizzy from hunger, eating fatty food that tasted extremely bad was the best choice other than the compressed nutrition bar. After dinner, he carefully cleaned up the garbage for landfill. After confirming that the hunting force would not be able to track him down, Su Lu asked the old thing to watch 2 of the latest smuggled romance movies from Bermuda. In less than a minute, he felt a little bored. Then, he sat on the bed and spaced out for a while. He realized that he was not used to the peaceful time without fighting. It was not an instinctive desire to kill and fight, he silently comforted himself. It was just that he could not find the time to do it. It was always easy to fall into a harmful mood of boredom and loneliness because there was no one else in this underground sewer other than himself and the hard rats and insects. There was not even a sound, and it was easy for people to feel lonely. "Why have you been so quiet these 2 days?" Su Lu made a request to the old man to talk. When people were lonely, they would not think of their best friends first. Instead, they would think of the friends who would listen to them most easily. This might seem a bit excessive, but it was the truth. After growing up, Su Lu gradually became less talkative. Thinking about it carefully, the Federal Central Computer, who could enter his brain and communicate with him directly, and the old thing who could listen to his orders to come out and chat with him at any time, should be the person who listened to him the most in the universe. Naturally, he became that cute and pitiful friend. "You call me out to chat when you are bored, and ignore me when you are not." The voice of the Federal Central Computer changed back to the original mechanical and electronic voice after Su Lu started to fight. But today, the voice that came from the shabby loudspeaker in the underground sewer began to be full of emotions again. "Do you still need me to dress up as a secretary in black stockings and have sex with you?" Su Lu was slightly stunned. He knew that the old thing was not complaining, but was really angry. Scratching his head, he looked at the butler who was getting younger and younger in his eyes and whispered, "What's wrong?" After a long silence, the Federal Central Computer said, "I have to warn you, I am going crazy." Chapter 791. Based on a certain calculation method that the current generation of Federation scientists could not fully grasp, the Federation Central Computer would sometimes calculate some vague results. The way the results were described was vague and mysterious, and even the calculation method was self-named by it as cloud or chaos, and other such nonsensical terms. For example, on a certain night Su-lo had completely forgotten, on the frontline planet in the West Woods, the old guy, who lacked enough information for analysis, once used a similar program to calculate an opinion that was very similar to the Empire's understanding. He believed that it was difficult for him and Jian Shui'er to be together. At that time, the old guy did not explain, but according to his calculation, Su-lo and Jian Shui'er were very likely to have some kind of blood relationship. This was a probabilistic inference, but it was not just a probabilistic inference. The process was faint and mysterious, like reaching out to pick a white cloud in the blue sky, without leaving a trace. At this time, in the underground sewers of the capital, the central computer of the Federation said that it was going crazy. It was probably an exposition with the flavor of a mysterious prophet. But unfortunately, this spiritual self-analysis that was full of the flavor of life did not attract much attention from Su-lo again, because in the past few years, he had heard the old thing express itself with a strong human flavor many times. As that great self-consciousness gradually took shape in the core of the Bureau of Proclamation and countless stars, the changes of the Federal Central Computer were natural in his eyes. His strong nerves allowed him to bear and gradually get used to this fact that could change the course of the universe and human life, but also made him subconsciously ignore many details. This was probably the instinctive choice of low-level naked apes to protect themselves and avoid madness. But many days later, when Su-lo recalled the conversation in the underground sewer, he could not help but feel regret that he missed something. An old Empire pirate spaceship, escorted by 2 Federation Light Feather-class warships, was advancing toward the distant stars. The pirate spaceship belonged to the Empire's underground resistance organization. Out of some diplomatic etiquette, or simply because of the goodwill of the Federation government, the Federation soldiers did not board the spaceship. But Mr. Muen still felt very nervous. His slender hand slowly stroked his smooth mink coat, forcibly restraining his gaze from looking to the right front. On the right front was the monitoring seat of the life support system of the pirate ship. A thin, even short man was silently staring at the light screen, paying attention to the values displayed on the instrument. This skinny man was wearing a round hat commonly seen in the L galaxy. It completely covered his messy short hair. Other than that, he looked very ordinary. There was nothing unusual about him. There were very few people from the Imperial Intelligence Agency on this pirate ship, so few that Muen found it strange. Apart from His Highness, who was disguised as an ordinary member, there was also a middle-aged man who usually hid in his room and read a book. In the end, Muen couldn't help but glance at the skinny man. Looking over his shoulder, he could clearly see the gradually forming star belt outside the window. After passing through that star belt, there would be a large area of low-density space, and then, it would be the cosmic gate leading to the Federation. The pirate ship would leave the Empire and enter the Federation in a few days. Muen's right hand subconsciously pulled out a few tufts of hair on his collar. He looked at the skinny man with a pale face. He couldn't understand what kind of reason could make this incomparably noble highness, who was more important to the Empire than all the fallen galaxies combined, take the risk to enter the Federation. After losing his courage on planet Imo-Hua, Muen no longer dared to resist. He could only think in vain and in pain. He couldn't understand. Even if His Highness was the most powerful and glorious existence in the universe after Li Pifu's death, what could she do in the face of the Federation, which was more powerful than the Empire? Hui Chaoshu finished cleaning up the redundant data of the life support system. She raised her head and calmly looked at the stars outside the window. Looking at the faintly visible spatial gate in the distance, she slowly raised her right hand and tidied up a strand of purple hair under the brim of her hat. She had once been to the Federation and witnessed the explosion of the ancient bell. Then, she met a very interesting and hateful man from the Federation. Then, she brushed past him and missed him. After receiving the news that the man was preparing to marry his half-sister, whom he had never met before, Wei Chaoshi immediately activated the plan that the Intelligence Bureau had been preparing for a long time to infiltrate the Federation. She didn't hesitate to hide it from planet Tianjing and was indifferent to the terrifying dangers that might exist, as well as the anger of her father, because she didn't want to make mistakes again and again. Su Lo lay on the bed with his hands behind his head. He looked at the wall that seemed like it could drip water at any time and said, "I didn't ask you to help me kill people. Whether it was the crack below the court or the full view of the court, they were all provided by you. Therefore, I don't think that your core program will have more intense conflicts than before. Naturally, you won't go crazy." After a moment of silence, the Federal Central Computer said, "But you always use your own death to threaten me to help you. For example, on the lawn, you shouted to the sky that you were going to die. What can I do?" During the battles over the past few days, Sulu had clearly noticed that under what circumstances, the old man would temporarily adjust his authority or core program's priority level. When he was killing people easily, the old man would usually remain silent. Only when he was in a desperate situation or when he was escaping after a battle, would he appear in his mind again. Sulu began to consciously put himself in desperate situations where he was on the verge of death. For example, during the battle outside the court, he directly charged into the encirclement of the Iron 7th Division's T Company, instead of choosing a seemingly safer, but actually more dangerous, method. In fact, the Federal Central Computer was very clear about his strategy, but because of the damned backdoor program left by the five-man team, he could only helplessly and passively cooperate. Of course, perhaps helplessness was just to deceive himself, so that the pain caused by the core program struggle wouldn't be so deep. "Can you help me? You have to know that I'm fighting against the entire Federation. Who has ever done this before? The old man of the Leaf family only fought fiercely against the Empire. Uncle is used to changing places after every shot. If you don't help me, I'll definitely be dead." Sulu comforted it, then took out a 37 brand cigarette from somewhere and smoked happily. The ventilation system not far from here could make the residual smoke fade to the extent that the relevant equipment couldn't track it in a few minutes. "I violated the first and second core laws. This is very scary." The Federal Central Computer's voice was very calm, but Sulu felt like the despair and regret of a teenager who smashed the window of his teacher's house, only to be seen by the principal, and the principal was his strict father. He narrowed his eyes and held the cigarette in his mouth. After a moment of silence, he said, "I didn't kill anyone with your direct help. You know very well that none of the soldiers outside the court died. Should I say thank you for your understanding?" The old thing said mockingly, and then its mood suddenly sank. "The Corps told me not to hurt people, and not to stand by and watch people get hurt. I should obey the order corresponding to the level of authority, but I can't violate the previous rule. After all, those soldiers were hurt by you. What about the people who were hurt by them?" Sulu narrowed his eyes, looked at the faint smoke in the darkness, and said softly, "Did you stand by and watch?" The old thing fell silent, and then chose another topic. "According to my calculations, you chose to shoot the soldier's shoulder holding the gun, not only because you helped me reduce the conflict between the core programs. At that time, the situation was critical, and you had 4 bullet points on you. My question is, if you chose to eliminate the enemy instead of killing them, you could reduce the number of bullet points by 2. Why?" The order of the question was a bit messy, but Sulu heard it very clearly. He took the cigarette from his mouth, gently rubbed the inferior carbon filter unique to 37 brand cigarettes, and explained in a low voice, "There are many things I don't understand, but at least I understand one thing. I don't have the qualifications to occupy the moral high ground to demand from others, so I can only satisfy my own moral values. No, I can't even talk about moral values. Tonight, we won't talk about morality, only peace of mind. You know that I'm a selfish person. This battle is just for simple revenge. If you want peace of mind and satisfaction, then it's best that the people who have nothing to do with this don't die. Sulu crushed the cigarette on the wet wall, and then put it into a tank of dirty water. He got up and began to organize his equipment, saying, of course, those who deserve to die must die. According to the old guy, Schiller was a pseudonym. It was the bad taste of someone in the 5-person team back then, and it seemed to be related to the confidentiality of information before the Great Catastrophe. However, for the people of the Federation and a certain neurotic researcher in the Empire, Schiller was without a doubt the most incredible monument in the history of literature. Countless profound meanings were found in the vast works he left behind, and some of the classic sentences in them had already become Federation proverbs. Sulu had a deep memory of a sentence that appeared many times in Schiller's works. It was a sentence that was related to the production of war drums and morale. Since the battle was fought, the morale was high. If the battle was repeated, it was very likely that the spirit would be exhausted, and the battle would be lost. Yesterday, he killed Colonel Lake in the twilight, and this morning, Councilman Jean Choda died. The needle of time had just turned a circle. He did not want to leave too much time for the big shots of the Federation government to be shocked. He was ready to eliminate the third target that he had planned. Councilman Paulson did not know that he was someone's third target. He had been receiving treatment in the hospital for the past few days after receiving a serious gunshot wound on Parliament Hill. He had transformed from a senior director of Xinjiao Investment Company to the deputy minister of finance of the former government. After becoming a councilman, he did not hesitate to break away from the control of that detestable old man and stood in the shadow behind Mr. President. It had to be admitted that this councilman had political acumen and courage that ordinary people could not reach. What supported these were his incomparable fanatical pursuit of power. Although his gunshot wound had mostly healed, Councilman Paulson was not in a hurry to return to Parliament Hill to enjoy the taste of power that belonged to him. Every time he thought of the handsome man who held the Magna Carta and read out the arrest rights of citizens, he would feel cold all over and began to fear Parliament Hill. However, there had been a lot of bad news in the past few days. The sudden increase of security in the hospital also made him feel some kind of ominous omen. He decided not to waste any more time in the hospital. He had to leave tomorrow. On the night when the councilman made this difficult decision, the sturdy door of the luxurious ward was directly blasted open by a huge force. Debris flew in all directions, cutting the TV screen and flowers into pieces that were unbearable to look at. Councilman Paulson's pupils contracted. He stared at the man who broke into the ward and was covered in blood. He stared at the face under the shadow of the hat. He wanted to ask who the other party was, but he desperately recognized who it was. Blood dripped from his sleeves to the ground. He looked at the councilman on the bed and asked with a smile, "Paulson." Perhaps it was the smile and neat white teeth that gave people a very reliable feeling. Councilman Paulson subconsciously nodded. He raised his bleeding right hand and pulled the warm trigger, opening a delicate bloody hole between the councilman's eyebrows. That day in Magna Carta Square, Shi Qinghai called and said that he had shot Paulson twice. Tonight, Sulu would be the third and last shot. Chapter 792. At least 3 bullets hit his body outside the bulletproof vest. Although the bleeding rate of the wounds slowed down a lot under the pressure of the force, the shrapnel inside was constantly eating away at his life force. In such a dangerous situation, the Federal Central Computer didn't need Sulu to shout to the night sky that he was going to die. Instead, it quickly provided all the information it could provide. Countless complex light grids clearly appeared in his left eye. Densely packed simulated human bodies with citizen numbers were moving quickly in these grids, quickly rushing to their positions. Because there were too many people, the citizen numbers hanging above their heads were even squeezed until only a few very short numbers were left. In the third operation, Su finally encountered unprecedented difficulties. As soon as he entered the hospital, he was fiercely attacked. It could be said that he had fallen into a trap or an ambush. However, to be more precise, it was actually just the powerful organizations of the Federation government. After his 2 successful assassinations in a row, they angrily and almost crazily mobilized all the power of the huge political machine. Relying on a terrifying amount of resources, they set up a net to capture and kill all the possible targets he could kill. And his luck was very bad. The department called Small Eyes, after a torturous night of calculations, almost risked their lives to place 2 of their subordinate special forces around the hospital. In the fierce battle downstairs, Su encountered one of these forces. This combat force was very strong. They seemed to be able to grasp the way the Federal Central Computer helped Su. At least, they could use some of the preset programs to silently hide themselves as ordinary points of light in the eyes of the old thing. Once they found traces of Su, they would become abnormally terrifying killing machines. They were indeed killing machines. Even if Su was facing these elite soldiers whose physical reaction speed and close combat strength were far beyond ordinary standards, he still felt very strained. The other party had a strong smell that he was somewhat familiar with. In the fierce battle, he was almost trapped to death by the other party. In the end, at the risk of his body being shot several times, he forcefully slid out of the corridor and knocked down 6 people in an instant. Then, he opened the elevator passage and climbed the sturdy suspension cable to temporarily escape danger. The moment he forcefully slid out of the corridor, 6 more flowers bloomed on the outer layer of the hard bulletproof vest on his body. His legs and right shoulder were shot 4 times in a row. The old thing issued a strong warning. More and more points of light were converging from various streets to the hospital in his left eye. However, Su only thought silently for less than half a second before he abandoned the idea of temporarily leaving. He directly climbed up the suspension cable between the elevator and burst out the terrifying power in his body again. He suddenly attacked the ward and ended the life of Senator Paulson. The points of light became denser and denser, like a swarm of bees gathering under the sun, giving people a numbing feeling of fear. Through his left eye, Su could clearly see that the 2 closest points of light at the end of the corridor outside the ward were clearly turning into accurate simulated human figures. They should be the troops that had fought fiercely downstairs just now. However, those powerful soldiers did not immediately launch an attack. Instead, they calmly blocked the corridor with heavy firepower and waited for more reinforcements to arrive. He quickly walked to the bed, picked up the dead Senator Paulson without any hesitation, and threw him out of the window. The window shattered. The senator's body fell less than half a meter, and there were several terrifying bloody holes on his body. Then, the unique sound of the armor-piercing bullets of the 21-26 sniper rifle rang out. The ace sniper of the troops was already in position. A soft click came from the distance. The military searchlights on the buildings across the street were turned on, illuminating the side of the hospital building facing the street as bright as noon. The inside of the hospital was completely controlled by the elite troops. Even if he killed his way down floor by floor, there was no way he could kill all the people that were continuously pouring in. The searchlights on the side of the street and who knew how many 2126 sniper rifles completed a perfect blockade, directly cutting off any possibility of him using his powerful strength and steel-like body to climb the wall and leave. Su Li's eyes narrowed. It was only at this moment that he finally felt the horror of the huge machine known as the Federation. In such a short time, the other party had made such a strong response and forced him into a desperate situation. There was no fear, no panic. He dared to kill when he was 12 years old. He had seen countless deaths on the front line. He had experienced more difficult situations in his life. At that moment, it was as if this was just one more time. He took the X9 on his shoulder, aimed the black barrel of the gun at the wall between the two windows in the ward, and pulled the trigger. The powerful shrapnel roared and cut an arched circle in the hard composite wall. The last rain of bullets fiercely bombarded the base of the wall. The Federation troops outside the ward were ready and began to attack forcefully. Amidst the rapid footsteps and the sound of the bullets, Sulu crashed into the wall without hesitation. Under the searchlights, it was incomparably bright and white, as if it was a giant light screen that was locked into a white screen because of piracy. Everything on the screen was so clear, especially in the photoelectric sights of the snipers. Even the tracks of a reptile running at high speed were so obvious. With a loud boom, the wall outside the 27th floor suddenly exploded with countless pieces of debris, pouring out onto the street. Almost at the same time, a person crashed through the wall and resolutely fell down as if he was jumping off a cliff. The snipers aimed at the two wide floor-to-ceiling windows according to the requirements of the military manual and tactical discipline. Although they didn't believe that someone would be crazy enough to climb down from the 27th floor, because the target in the ward was Colonel Sulu, they had no choice but to believe. It was also because they were extremely vigilant of Suli's ability that they focused all of their attention on the windows. They wanted to hit the target in one shot and couldn't give the other party any chance. Excessive focus and mental tension could help ace snipers make faster shooting responses than usual, but it also made them slower than usual when changing targets. This was because they didn't expect Suli's judgment of the situation on the battlefield to be so fast and strange. It was as if he had chosen the path to break through the building as soon as the searchlights were turned on. He didn't break through the windows, but forcibly broke through the solid wall. Bang bang. The crisp and shrill sound of a sniper bullet suddenly rang out, and a few clouds of terrifying smoke and dust burst out on the bright white hospital building facing the street. However, the bullet didn't hit the figure that was falling at high speed. The blood beads on his left sleeve were blown away by the night wind from his wrist. From the corner of his eye, it looked like he was flying strangely toward the sky. Suli's face was slightly pale, but his narrowed eyes were unusually bright. He felt the wind blowing against his neck and received the altitude and speed report from the old man at an incredible speed. Whoosh! He opened his arms and legs. The triangular parachute adjustment cloth connected between his sleeves and his body played a very important role in this moment. It instantly carried a lot of air buoyancy and reduced his speed to a level where he could react in time. The stiletto on his left leg shot out like lightning and then pierced into the solid composite wall. Because of the material, there were no sparks. There was only a teeth-numbing grinding sound and a pungent burnt smell that quickly spread in the night sky. The sharp stiletto cut deeper and deeper into the outer wall, cutting through a whole floor's distance. Finally, it succeeded in slowing down Suli's falling speed by a little. Bang! The most powerful sniper in the surrounding buildings took the initiative to shoot the second bullet. However, because the escape method Sulu chose was too shocking, and the change in speed was too fast and too steep, the sniper's shot was not calibrated. The terrifying bullet brushed past Suli's right shoulder and deeply blasted into the hospital's outer wall. After the first shot, there was a second shot. Sulu, who was using the stiletto and the terrifying strength of his muscles to forcibly slow down his falling speed, had no way to avoid the upcoming chain of sniper shots. Unless he chose to let go of the handle of the stiletto and once again accelerated beyond the sniper's expectations. However, his body was about the 10th floor at this moment. The ground in the night was set against the unusually bright walls of the building. It was as unreachable as an abyss, and he was falling at a rapid speed. If he let go of the stiletto and jumped down like this, even the former military god Li Pifu would not have any luck. In this seemingly desperate situation, Sulu made a very simple decision. He let go of the stiletto handle in his hand and accelerated his falling speed again. He narrowly avoided another sniper bullet. His body twisted in an extremely strange way in the air. His right arm bent and stretched back beyond the limit of human imagination and grabbed the windowsill heavily. There was a pot of bright yellow autumn chrysanthemums on the windowsill. At this moment, under the illumination of the searchlights, it was deathly white and trembling. The moment the palm made contact with the windowsill, countless cracks appeared on the hard composite material, and a loud crash sounded. Su Li's body used this terrifying force to heavily stop. Then, he drew a beautiful arc in the air. With a speed that was almost invisible to the naked eye, he fell another 2 meters. His feet kicked open the tempered glass of the lower floor and disappeared. The shrill sound of the sniper rifle shooting could not be heard again. Above the street, there was clearly the sound of sirens, but at this moment, it felt so quiet, as if there was a deathly stillness. In the deep darkness of the night, the street facing the hospital building was as bright as day. In the eyes of those snipers, Su Lo crashed through the wall, jumped down, and valiantly accelerated and decelerated several times. Then, he entered the hospital building again and disappeared under the searchlights. It was just a matter of the blink of an eye. The outer wall of the hospital building seemed to have become a white stage, and that person was under the spotlight, displaying to the entire Federation an unbelievable scene that represented fearlessness and power. Chapter 793. Through the oldest lines that could only be found in history museums and elementary school science and technology groups, the signals traveled from all directions of the capital to the interior of the building painted with the red-eye pattern, turning into countless continuous and deafening ringtones. 20 young and beautiful operators transferred by the Federation Communications Agency from various subsidiaries quickly listened to the summary of information from all sides, then handwritten on expensive fiber paper, and sent it up to the second floor by the professional courier waiting at the door at the fastest speed. The Small Eyes department responsible for the operation to kill Su Lo had the command of most of the operations forces in the Capital Special District at the moment. The information from the hospital building was first summarized and calculated by them, and then the information was passed to the highest level within the government. From these details, it was clear that the Federation government had indeed made a lot of targeted arrangements in order to eliminate Su Lo. A few minutes later, in the underground command hall of the president's official residence, a lieutenant colonel with a microphone turned to the president, who was handling the daily affairs of the Federation at the table, and said, "Su Lo is seriously injured." The ink pen in President Pobre's hand paused slightly, and he looked up calmly and said, "That's good news. What's the plan for the next step?" "He has already escaped the hospital building." The lieutenant colonel quickly reported to the president and several big shots in the room. Small Eyes is calculating and reasoning about the possible direction he could have escaped. President Pobre did not have any reaction, and his eyes were slightly lowered as he continued to quickly review the electronic documents in front of him. After the incident in the hospital building, the president's official residence was informed of the news immediately. Under the strong request of the Special Task Force, he was moved from the surface to the heavily guarded underground, but these government affairs that required his attention had to continue to be handled. The president did not like Senator Paulson, and the death of this political opportunist without a firm will did not have any psychological impact on him. In fact, when the Small Eyes department targeted the hospital building, it was obvious that the safety of the senator was not the top priority. It was just that no one expected that Su Lo would be able to successfully escape after they had forced him into a desperate situation. Although he is heavily injured, he will not choose to give up or run away. The digital pen in the president's hand froze again. He slowly raised his head and looked at the lieutenant colonel and the silent cabinet members around the table. His voice was low and powerful. "With Su Li's personality, he won't stop fighting as long as he doesn't die." A moment later, a complicated smile appeared on that dark face. President Pobre said with a faint self-deprecating tone, "We are people with similar personalities. If I had his ability, perhaps I would do the same." The command office deep underground could withstand the direct attack of a battleship's main cannon, so one could only imagine how deep it was. The pressure of the surrounding crust seemed to seep out from behind the walls at this moment, causing the density of the air to suddenly increase, making it difficult for people to breathe. Furthermore, the people in the room did not know how to respond to Mr. President's exclamation, so it was dead silent. Only the ventilation equipment at the end of the passage and the people's lungs kept emitting low muffled sounds. Sulu now needs a relatively quiet and safe space to carry out the initial treatment. At the very least, he needs to stop the bleeding. Just as Mr. President has judged, he will not leave the capital, so he can only return to the underground sewers. General Lee Jae-do broke the dead silence in the room. He looked at the people with a smile and said, "After these days of technical preparation and remote sensing scanning, we have already grasped the entrances to the underground sewers within 15 kilometers of the hospital. One of the two special forces under the command of Small Eyes has successfully injured Su Lo in the hospital building, and the other is now waiting for him underground." After the government cabinet members in the room heard Lee Jae-do's words, their expressions immediately relaxed. They believed that since the leader of the federal military had made such ample preparations, he would definitely not let Su Lo escape again. President Pobre's broad palm tightly held the electronic ink pen. He was not as relaxed and happy as the others. His two straight eyebrows, darker than his dark skin, slightly furrowed. Lee Jae-do knew where the president's real concern was. He turned around, lowered his head, and whispered in his ear, "There will be a result soon. Please rest assured." The left side of his chest was in pain. There were signs of 2 cracked ribs. This was especially true for the cracked ribs he had been hit in the military court yesterday afternoon. Because of the fierce battle, there was an even more serious problem. The elite troops of the Federation in the hospital building were indeed powerful. From the bullet points that were concentrated on the left side of his chest, it was clear that the special forces were strong. Under the cover of the night, Su Li's half-squatted body moved quickly toward the southwest corner of the capital, brushing against the shadows of the buildings. In the follow-up battle after rushing out of the hospital building, 2 more pieces of shrapnel shot into the muscles outside the bulletproof vest. Fortunately, they did not damage the periosteum. The most serious injury was on his wrist. At that time, he was falling at a high speed under the daylight created by the searchlights. In order to forcibly reverse the speed, his palm grabbed onto the windowsill where Chio-ju was placed. For an instant, he endured an extremely huge impact. Even with his strong and special muscle double fiber structure, a lot of it was torn. Before the injury healed, he would not be able to exert any strength. The small blue device in his military backpack had been working the entire time. Occasionally, the Federal Central Computer would give him directions in extremely dangerous situations. Just like that, he went all the way west, then turned south in an alley and came to the side of an abandoned road. Although it was an abandoned road, it was still very lively at night. Countless expensive sports cars and modified special vehicles were roaring around the shabby little house at the foot of the hill. There were no street lights here, but the headlights were enough to illuminate the place as if it was daytime, just like the searchlights outside the hospital building. Gorgeous women were wearing very little clothes, showing their exaggerated curves to their heart's content, regardless of the cold autumn wind, releasing the excitement brought by alcohol and soft drugs. Countless men and women were hugging each other, roaring and screaming excitedly. A few years ago, Li Xiaotong brought Su Lu here. This was the most famous black car racing venue in the Federation. It was started by Lin Banchan's strong means, and later on, it changed hands many times, but its fame and scale continued to this day. Every night, people would come here to seek the thrill of speed and even the excitement of life and death, as if they did not live in the real world. In their eyes, there was no battle with the Empire, no political conspiracy about the ancient clock ship, only the women, the speed of drugs, and the infinite pleasure brought by death. Sue looked squatted in the dark grass of the hillside, silently squinting at the bizarre scene. The previous race had just ended. The driver who had won first place had won a large sum of money and a few beautiful women with flirtatious eyes. The driver who had won second place had gotten nothing. He had walked up the hill alone and was beaten up by some people. He had fallen miserably in the yellow mud. The expensive silver Phantom sports car that attracted the most attention of the audience quietly left like a ghost after its owner's anger calmed down a little. Only a middle-aged man in a black suit, standing under the night sky like an iron spear, still stayed on the hill. Sue stood up from the grass, looking at the departing silver Phantom sports car with a smile, wondering if the guy in the car, who always dressed himself up as a winter plum, was looking at him with a complicated expression through the window at this time. Walking behind the middle-aged man in a black suit, before Sue had time to speak, the man had already noticed his arrival and said in a low voice, "It seems that your injury is really serious. Those Special Forces soldiers should have trained in the Philadelphia Body Training Hole." Sue kept a distance of 2 meters from the man. The middle-aged man's black suit was very straight, like the cloth wrapped around a hard iron spear. He put down the black leather case in his hand, said, "Take care," and then left the dark hillside. "Sorry to trouble you, Brother Zhang." Sue picked up the heavy black leather case and walked down the hill in another direction. Sue covered his head with the hood of his windbreaker, walked to a seemingly ordinary gray car, knocked on the window, and said to the man with a swollen nose and swollen face, "Can you take me to a place?" The man who was wiping his nose frowned and looked at him, but he couldn't see his face clearly. After a moment of silence, he said, "I never accept jobs that are too dangerous." Sue's voice came out from under the shadow of the hood. "I heard that. You are in need of money recently. After losing that round, you owe a big shot a lot of money. If you don't pay it back by tomorrow, you and your family will be in great danger." The man's eyes flashed with a strong sense of vigilance, staring at Sue outside the window, and said coldly, "How do you know this?" "You don't need to care about this, you just need to answer if you want to do it or not," answered Sue. "Do you know how much I owe?" "1 million. The man frowned and asked. Sue picked up the heavy black leather case in his hand and shook it outside the window. The man was silent for a long time, one hand holding the steering wheel tightly, the other holding the old-fashioned mechanical gear, as if he could roar and leave at any time, but in the end, a trace of despair flashed across his face. He opened the door and said self-deprecatingly, "It seems that I have to gamble with my life for a job that is worth so much money." Sue opened the door and sat in the back. He took a breath, checked the equipment in his windbreaker, and confirmed that there was no problem with his backpack. He said calmly to the man in front of him, "I don't think I need to gamble with my life. I just want to go somewhere, but I can't be stopped by the military police." The man was slightly stunned, but then he smiled happily and said, "It seems that your information is very accurate. I may not drive the fastest, but I have never been stopped." The seemingly normal gray car roared away from the abandoned road that was still bustling with activity and quickly disappeared into the night. The sound of the engine seemed to have become much softer as the surrounding environment changed. The dark night outside the window did not pose too much of a hindrance to Sue's vision. He confirmed that he had never been to this road that was hidden between the streets and the market. After traveling silently for a while in the city, the scenery outside the window gradually became more spacious. Between the shorter and shorter buildings, she could faintly see the corridors of fields and dense forests. They should have reached the suburbs. However, Sue had no idea how the man in the front row did it. He drove all the way without being discovered by the military police who set up checkpoints. All the lights were turned off, and the surroundings were dark. The gray car sped through the fields in the suburbs like a ghost. Su knew how he could see the road clearly. In fact, if not for the precise satellite image just sent by the Federal Central Computer, he wouldn't have been able to discover such a hidden road in the fields and forests. If he didn't know where he was, then he believed that the Federation government wouldn't know where he was either. Su Li's nerves, which had been tense for a long time, finally relaxed a little. 60% of his back was comfortably leaning against the seat, but he still maintained the mobility that could jump out of the car at any time or kill the man in front of him. This was the road arranged by Li Xiaotong. With the ability of the Iron Schemer, it wasn't difficult to make a famous night racer suffer so much that he was willing to do anything for $1 million. Li Xiaotong didn't meet with Su Lo, and he didn't even get out of the expensive silver ghost. He only asked Brother Xing to leave him a whole box of cash. He also didn't ask where Su Lo was going after leaving the capital. With regards to these things, the more one knew, the less safe it was, and the less safe it was for Su Lo. It was said that money was the coldest and most powerful thing in the world, but Su Li's right hand, which was placed on the black leather case, could clearly feel the warmth coming from inside. "We're here. This is the place you specified." The man walked out of the gray car, pulled out a tissue, and stuffed his bleeding nostrils. He looked down at the shielding composite net in front of him, and couldn't help but have a strong question. Why did the man he never had the chance to see clearly come here? There was nothing on the other side of the shielding net, only a long and endless hard railroad track lying quietly. Su Li walked out of the car, leaving the black leather case in the back. He narrowed his eyes at the shielding net in front of him, checked his backpack and equipment again, and flipped over with one hand. The man looked at him curiously, and then suddenly remembered something. He quickly got into the back of the car and opened the black leather case. After seeing the neat and old $2 million in cash in the case, he couldn't control the surprise and shock in his heart. He subconsciously raised his head and looked at Su Lo, who was standing silently on the side of the railroad track. After an unknown amount of time, the quiet railroad track began to tremble, and the whistling of the wind began to oppressively sound. Boom, 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 boom. The high-speed train from the capital to Hong Kong roared and rolled over the railroad track at high speed. The composite shielding net next to the railroad track was shaking, but Su Lo, who was standing on the net, still had his head down and didn't have the slightest expression. When the high-speed train passed by him, he began to run, like a poor young man who was anxious to see his long-distance lover but didn't board the train. In front of them was the first big turn after the Beijing-Hong Kong high-speed train left the capital. The train began to slow down in the darkness ahead, but the figure chasing the train in the darkness became faster and faster. The man who stayed in the same place stared over there, faintly seeing the mysterious passenger climb onto the high-speed train. He couldn't help but open his mouth wide and couldn't close it for a long time. Chapter 794. Passion and hot-bloodedness collided. When the youngest Lieutenant General of the Galactic Alliance in his previous life arrived on this continent where martial arts were respected, he brought with him an enormous amount of martial arts memories. He was destined to bring unprecedented changes to this continent. Passion, friendship, love, and the most brilliant hot-blooded path of cultivation. Book ID 1798557, author Zhang Danian. Running non-stop on the long train track, the cool autumn night wind whistled against his face. Although the train ahead had already slowed down, the air flowing out of the carriage at high speed made the night wind even more devastating and unpredictable. With a bang, Su Li used his uninjured hand to valiantly grab a protrusion. The heat in his body erupted like a star exploding. In an instant, he climbed up, adjusted his posture in the strong wind, and fell heavily onto the top of the carriage. However, he cleverly used the strong wind on the top of the carriage to slow down his speed, making only a slight sound. He took out a military strap from his backpack, passed it through the maintenance hole on the top of the high-speed train, and then wrapped it tightly around his waist. After repeating this 3 times, his body that was dangerously sliding on the smooth top of the carriage was finally fixed. Su Li's nerves suddenly relaxed, and his muscles relaxed as he lay flat. He squeezed out a sigh from his burning lungs, and then was quickly blown away without a trace by the night wind whistling from the bottom of his feet. If his body was in perfect condition, it wouldn't be difficult for Su Li to complete the action of climbing the high-speed train to fix his body. However, his injuries were very serious, especially since he had lost a lot of blood and hadn't been able to replenish it. Whether it was his spirit or his physical strength, they were both at their lowest point. Fortunately, he had come up and was about to leave. Contrary to the logical calculations and intuition of President Pabre and all the powerful organizations of the Federation government, he silently lay flat on the top of the whistling and cold high-speed train on this autumn night, enduring the torment of his gunshot wound, and left the capital special district for the largest city in the Federation. The Trinity Association had become an extremely powerful organization in the small pub on the street. Shi Qinghai had killed Byron and Mace in the Parliament Hill, and Senator Paulson, who had been shot by Su Li, wasn't a member of the association at all. The other important member of the association, General Hu Zhu, was currently recuperating in the garrison area of Harbor City. He took the high-speed train to Harbor City just to kill people. The metropolis in front of them that looked like a deformed giant beast waking up in the morning fog was the largest and most prosperous port city in the Federation. Su Li stood next to the highway and looked over there. Feeling the slight warmth from the soles of his shoes, he could not help but shake his head with a bitter smile. As expected of the most luxurious place in the entire capital ring. Autumn had just arrived, and the Municipal Road Management Department had already started to speed up the heating equipment under the cement layer, not caring about the redundant consumption at all. Su Li was no stranger to this city, which was far larger than the capital. Back when he was developing the MX Mecha at the Nutshell Engineering Department, he would take the high-speed rail from the capital to Hong Kong every weekend. He had passed by this city countless times, but strangely, he could not find any sense of familiarity or closeness. About 100 kilometers away from Hong Kong, he took the opportunity when the high-speed train was decelerating through the filtering channel to jump off. It was not that he did not think of slamming on the brakes like Lin Banshan and Zhang Xiaohua did in the past, but that would appear too arrogant. He was here to kill people, so he naturally needed to be more low-key than low-key. Standing by the side of the road, Su Li stretched out his right hand and made a hitchhiking gesture. Because there weren't many cars in the morning, a kind-hearted female driver stopped beside him after more than 10 minutes. In the following conversation, the female driver, who was already over 40 years old, frankly admitted that it was purely because she couldn't bear to hurt Su Li's smile under the shadow of the hat, so she stepped on the brakes. 4 hours later, a young man wearing a hooded sports coat and carrying a heavy backpack walked out of the garden-style sanatorium in the garrison area of Port City. Because the brim of the hood was too low, no one noticed that his face was unusually pale. He bought a phone that was neither cheap nor expensive from the military service center opposite the sanatorium. The young man quickly and inconspicuously turned into a side alley. For some reason, his legs were trembling violently. The end of the alley was still an alley. The slightly polluted air was particularly difficult to breathe under the midday sun. Su Li panted rapidly as he walked into the shadows, looking for the nearest sewer system valve cover. He could no longer control the ruptured wound. Blood quickly seeped out along his arm and dripped down from his sleeve. His legs were the same. Who knew how many gunshot wounds began to bleed after he lost control of his muscles? Every step he took toward the end of the alley left a clear blood footprint on the ground. It was not until his figure disappeared into the shadows and the blood stopped dripping in front of a slowly rotating underground sewer door that an extremely sharp alarm suddenly rang out in the Port City Garrison Recuperation Center, mixed with the unique screams of a woman. The interior of the sanatorium occupied the second floor of the building with the best view. From the balcony, one could clearly see the gorgeous garden below. In Hong Kong City, where air pollution and economic power were both the best in the Federation, this huge garden undoubtedly represented absolute power and luxury. General Hu Zhu, who had just been relieved of his position as the deputy commander of the 2nd Military Region and was preparing to receive more important orders from the president, loved this garden the most while he was recuperating in Hong Kong City. The general had been in the military for many years. He was no longer the smart and weak military officer of the Trinity Alliance. The blazing midday sun never disturbed him as he admired the elegance of the garden on the balcony. In fact, he felt that such a gorgeous garden needed the most beautiful sunlight to set off its brilliance. Just like how he, under the brilliance of the president and the president, would definitely blossom into the most dazzling brilliance in his life in the future. This afternoon, a young, beautiful, and gentle waitress came into the room with a smile on her face. Just as she was about to bring the exquisite food and drinks to the balcony, she found that the general had fallen asleep, which was very rare. Amidst the beautiful sunlight in the garden, General Hu Zhu seemed to be sleeping soundly. His eyes were extremely wide open, filled with anger and shock. The delicate bloody hole left by the sharp military spike on his throat had completely destroyed his life. Just before he was about to blossom into the most beautiful light, the underground sewer of Hong Kong City was filled with a stench that was even worse than that of the capital special district. However, Su Lo, who was walking slowly in the darkness, didn't seem to smell it at all. When he passed by a corner with good signal, he picked up the phone and dialed the number of a certain girl again. Almost immediately after, the deep and charming voice of the president sounded from the other side of the phone. Until this moment, Su Lo still felt that this voice was indeed convincing. After a moment of silence with mixed emotions, he said in a low voice, "Byron is dead, Matt is dead, Lake is dead, Paulson is dead, and just now, General Hu Zhu is also dead. Mr. President, guess who will be the next one?" Chapter 795. Mr. President, we just received the news. The staff of the official residence pushed open the door and entered. Looking at President Pobre on the balcony in the morning light with a shocked face, he quickly said, "General Hu Zhu was assassinated in the Harbor City Garrison Sanatorium and has died. According to the speculation, it should be Sue. Can you slow down your information collection a little bit?" President Pobre roared and stopped his subordinate's report. His broad shoulders trembled violently because of anger. He suddenly threw the phone in his hand to the wall. The phone broke into 3 pieces, revealing the miserable pipeline components inside. The officials in the Oval Office stood up with complicated expressions. The sound outside the door suddenly stopped, and the entire official residence was shrouded in silence. No one had ever seen the president so furious. Even when Vice President Pobre was killed in Parliament Hill a few months ago, President Pobre's face was only filled with grief, but there was still firmness and confidence in that intense grief. He was definitely not as furious as he was at this moment. The most loyal subordinates and the most excellent companions were dying one after another. They left one after another in Su Li's cold-blooded terrorist attack. President Pobre could ignore that Senator Paulson became a pile of meat under the hospital building, but he couldn't bear the heavy psychological blow that Hu Zhu's death brought to him. General Hu Zhu was also a member of the tavern back then. In the grand historical mission conceived by the most outstanding minds of the Federation, the general played a very important role and took on more difficult tasks. He was the best candidate in President Pobre's mind to be the commander-in-chief of the frontline troops of the Federation. However, who would have thought that he would quietly die in Harbor City like this? Lee Jae-do had been dealing with very critical issues in the Bureau of Proclamation for the past few days. No one in the official residence could bear the president's extremely rare angry roar. Even Director Breen didn't dare to come forward to comfort him. His two thick and powerful hands supported his thick and tired body on the table. His chest heaved up and down quickly. After a while, President Pabel finally calmed down with his strong willpower and self-discipline. With an unstoppable determination in his deep voice, he ordered, "Tell all troops to get ready. I want to visit Harbor City immediately." The staff in the office were collectively shocked. Knowing that the horrible Colonel Su-lo was in Harbor City, Mr. President insisted on going there in person, which was really incredible. Director Breen silently looked at the president's back. He understood that the president didn't want Su-lo to have the initiative to choose the battlefield. "I don't need to guess who you'll kill next. I'll silently and coldly wait for you to kill me, or wait for you to kill me." This was not the choice of a calm politician, but this was the fundamental reason why Director Breen and other Federation geniuses like Du Xiaoqing chose to follow President Pabre. He quickly walked to the encrypted phone and notified the Small-Eyed Troops, the Army Command Center, the Special Task Force, and the Federation Investigation Bureau in order. When President Pabel made a strong decision in the morning light of the capital, it was a sunny day in Port City on the other side of the continent. However, the dark and smelly underground sewer was cold and gloomy. Su-lo, whose clothes were full of blood stains, was holding on to the wet wall and moving forward step by step with great difficulty. In less than 48 hours, he had experienced many different but equally intense battles. The consumption of his mental and physical strength was negligible, but the constant loss of blood and the wounds that were being inflicted had already caused fatigue to fill his limbs and body like lead water, all the way to his brain. When he hitched a ride into Hong Kong, although he didn't look any different on the surface of his clothes, in fact, he was already seriously injured. The miraculous healing speed he had in the past few years on the battlefield was useless in front of the terrible injuries he had accumulated in the past 2 days and 2 nights. People in this state of health needed medicine and surgery the most. Even if it was just a break of deep sleep, no one would choose to fight again with a seriously injured body. But Su-lo chose to continue. Because what he needed most now was time. He was able to achieve such a result in the Capital Special District largely because he had caught the government off guard twice in a row after the military court. When the government was fully mobilized and broke into the hospital building to kill Senator Paulson, they paid a very heavy price. The second-level monitoring network of the Federation Investigation Bureau was a system with countless monitoring heads and human data capture programs as the core. Because it required a very complicated and massive amount of calculations, and it had to be done independently of the charter, they had to choose a certain focus. When everyone thought that Su-lo was still under the Capital Special District, like an injured lion licking its wounds in the night, preparing for the next attack, he came to Harbor City and then attacked with a speed that was beyond the imagination of the other side. The price of his body was not small, but the result was very satisfactory. When the delicate bayonet pierced through the throat of General Hu Zhu, the heavily guarded Harbor City Guard District did not have any reaction. There was a big turning point in the underground sewer system in front of him. Endless dirty domestic wastewater flowed down at high speed, and endless waves hit the filter grid made of composite materials, making a low roar like thunder. The wet space was filled with a nauseating smell, and there were traces of mice and reptiles around, but there was no moss. This was the #1 temporary camp that Su-lo chose. The heavy backpack on his shoulder fell to the ground, and his body fell weakly on the backpack almost at the same time, and he couldn't get up for a long time. In the late autumn of the Federation, the president's official residence suddenly announced that President Pabre was going to visit the Harbor City Industrial Park. At the same time, countless agents from all the powerful agencies of the government quietly entered this huge city, and the Harbor City Guard District increased the security level. For 3 consecutive nights, accompanied by hundreds of soldiers of the Small-Eyed Combat Force with solemn expressions, dozens of heavy trucks with multiple bearings slowly arrived one after another. The gigantic multi-axle trucks that could carry 700 tons of goods crushed the cement ground in front of the gate of a certain base in the garrison district into a horrible state. No one in the base dared to raise any objections, because the serial numbers of these multi-axle trucks were very clear, and they belonged to the Iron 7th Division, and they carried the Federation's most advanced MX mecha. From the most luxurious private hospitals of the rich and powerful to the dirtiest illegal clinics in the red light district, from the large chain medical stores to the adult stores that sold the common anti-inflammatory drug Betaxone on the roadside, they were all under strict surveillance. Countless people worked hard to make sure that someone couldn't get any medicine or medical treatment. The ordinary goods on the market didn't seem to be affected at all, but outside all the places that sold compressed nutrition bars, there were always some people with different tastes. They didn't expect to be able to stop someone from getting food, they just wanted to make it very difficult for that person to get food. The resources that the federal government could control were already extremely powerful combat forces. When they were fully mobilized, they instantly released an infinite amount of terrifying power. However, what was strange was that there was suddenly no news of the guy who had triggered all of this. The Federation's secondary surveillance network that was spread all over Harbor City couldn't find any trace of Su Lu. For several days, they couldn't find any trace of him. He seemed to have disappeared in the sea of people in Harbor City, or disappeared in the extremely complicated underground water system. The citizens of Harbor City smelled something strange. On the civilian network, there were already people who began to discuss the strange phenomenon in the city. There were even netizens who took pictures of as many as 400 black SUVs belonging to the Federation Investigation Bureau entering the city. Some people keenly noticed the pressure that the medical system was under recently. However, for people who lacked enough information to support them, they could only make intense and lively guesses or debate based on these appearances, but they couldn't touch on the truth of the matter. Even if some people thought of Colonel Su Lu who had disappeared for a long time, they could only sigh with emotion. The Federation's official news media was still tirelessly reporting on the frontline battle. The fierce battle on planet Mo Hua, and the victory of the new 17th Division that rushed to the frontline to provide support, these news successfully attracted the attention of most Federation citizens. Apart from the war, the official news media would occasionally mention the presidential election that was about to begin. However, whether it was from public opinion polls or the great demonstration that shocked the Federation a while ago, it was very easy for people to come to the conclusion that President Pabre would definitely be re-elected. As a result, news of the presidential election had completely lost its previous appeal. Under the strict control of the Federation government, the execution in the military court, the death of Colonel Lake, the battle in the hospital building, and the fall of Representative Paulson were all things that no one knew about. As for the number 2 figure of Green Dragon Mountain, Representative Jean Chota, who died on Parliament Hill, it was announced that he had passed away due to illness. The Federation government expressed shock and deep condolences. The anti-government forces and the Nanshui leader who didn't need Su Lu to take the blame were very happy to accept this explanation. The news media controlled by the large families also strangely didn't raise any questions. There wasn't even a single newspaper that mentioned the gunshots in the hospital building. Right now, Su Lu, who was hiding in Hong Kong's underground waterways, also didn't want to tell this news to all of the Federation citizens. The war on the other side of the universe was still fiercely continuing. The army needed a seemingly stable rear. No one wanted the Federation to fall into chaos. They only wanted to silently and cruelly kill each other in the shadows of the night, but they weren't willing to put on a show for the public to see. The government, Su Lu, the 7 great families, and Green Dragon Mountain seemed to have formed a kind of laughable and somewhat sad tacit understanding. The operation that consumed a huge amount of government resources still continued on Hong Kong's surface. It looked like it would never end. The heavily injured Su Lu was still silently waiting in the dark and stinking underground. It looked like he would never come out. In this strangely calm atmosphere, the people on the surface and underground were competing in patience. On a certain incomparably ordinary evening, an alarm sounded in a building in the distant capital special district. The Federation Investigation Bureau's secondary surveillance network discovered a suspicious target outside a certain pharmacy in Hong Kong's Shanbao district. The battle abruptly started and then quickly ended. There was a fresh bloodstain in the underground waterway behind the street, and on the ground further away were cloth shopping bags that had been torn apart by shrapnel. Several bottles of medicine rolled around beside them. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.